In the beginning, before time had carved its patterns into the fabric of existence, there was only the great void called Ginnungagap. Within this emptiness, two realms slowly took shape at opposite ends of the cosmic abyss. To the north lay Niflheim, a realm of primordial ice and mist, where cold fog drifted endlessly through landscapes of frozen silence. To the south burned Muspelheim, a world of fire and flame, where molten rivers carved through volcanic stone, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. Where the ice of Niflheim met the fire of Muspelheim, something extraordinary occurred. The collision of these opposing forces created the first stirrings of life. From the melting ice emerged Ymir, the first of the frost giants, a being of immense size and ancient power. As Ymir slept, more giants grew from his body, born from his sweat and breath, establishing the race that would become both ally and enemy to the gods who were yet to come. From this same primordial meeting of ice and fire came Audhumla, the great cow whose milk sustained Ymir. As she licked the salty ice blocks for nourishment, her warm tongue gradually revealed the form of Buri, the first of the gods. Buri begot Bor, and Bor took as his wife Bestla, a giantess of wisdom and strength. From their union came three sons who would reshape the cosmos itself: Odin, Vili, and Ve. These three brothers looked upon the world and saw its potential for greatness. They slew the ancient giant Ymir, and from his massive body, they crafted the foundations of all existence. His flesh became the earth, rich and fertile. His blood formed the seas and rivers that would flow between the lands. His bones became the mountains that would pierce the sky, and his skull formed the heavens above. His brain, scattered to the winds, became the clouds that would carry rain and snow across the realms. But the brothers' greatest creation was yet to come. In the center of all things, they planted a seed that would grow into Yggdrasil, the world tree. This was no ordinary tree, but an ash of immense proportions, its roots extending deep into the foundations of reality itself, its branches reaching so high they touched the very ceiling of the heavens. Yggdrasil became the axis around which all existence would revolve, connecting the 9 realms that the brothers would establish. At the highest branches of Yggdrasil sat Asgard, the realm of the Aesir gods, where golden halls rose majestically above clouds of silver and white. Here stood Gladsheim, Odin's great hall, and nearby, the most famous of all halls, Valhalla, where the honored dead would feast and fight until the end of time. Asgard was connected to the other realms by Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, whose colors shimmered with divine light, and whose guardian, Heimdall, could see across all the worlds. Below Asgard, on the same level as the great tree's trunk, lay Midgard, the realm of humans, surrounded by a vast ocean in which dwelt the Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr. This serpent had grown so large that it encircled the entire world, grasping its own tail in its mouth. Also on this level was Alfheim, the bright realm of the light elves, beings of beauty and wisdom who served as messengers and craftsmen for the gods. Beneath these realms, among the roots of Yggdrasil, lay the darker worlds. Jotunheim stretched across harsh landscapes of stone and ice, home to the giants who remembered the old ways and harbored ancient grudges against the gods. Vanaheim housed the Vanir, the older gods of fertility and wisdom who had made peace with the Aesir after a long war. Nidavellir, also called Svartalfheim, was the underground realm of the dwarves, master craftsmen who forged wonders in their deep halls beneath the mountains. Deeper still lay Helheim, the realm of the dead, ruled by Hel, half living and half corpse, who received all those who died of sickness or old age. And at the very bottom, in the darkest root of the world tree, was Niflhel, the lowest realm of the dead, where the most dishonored souls were sent to suffer in the cold and darkness. The world tree itself was tended by the three Norns, ancient women who lived by the well of Urd at the tree's base. Urd, who was named after the well she guarded, represented the past. Verdandi embodied the present, and Skuld held dominion over the future. Each day, these three sisters would water the great tree with water from the sacred well, mixed with white clay, keeping Yggdrasil healthy and strong. They also wove the fates of gods and men, their threads determining the destiny of all living things. In the branches of Yggdrasil lived many creatures. An eagle whose name was not spoken perched at the very top, its keen eyes seeing all that transpired in the 9 realms. Between its eyes sat Vedafólnir, a hawk whose sight was even sharper than the eagle's. At the base of the tree coiled Nidhugga, a great dragon who gnawed constantly at the roots, seeking to weaken the foundation of the world. Running up and down the trunk was Ratatoska, a squirrel who carried messages and insults between the eagle and the dragon, stirring up trouble with his gossip and lies. 4 stags also roamed the branches of Yggdrasil, eating the leaves and bark. Their names were Dain, Dvalin, Dunaya, and Durathror, and they represented the 4 winds that blew across the world, carrying weather and change to all the realms. As the gods established their domain in Asgard, they governed with wisdom and strength, but they were not alone in their rule. The Vanir gods, led by Njördur and his children Freyr and Freya, had initially been at war with the Aesir. This conflict, known as the Aesir-Vanir War, raged for years until both sides grew weary of the destruction. In the end, they made peace by exchanging hostages. Njördur, Freyr and Freya came to live in Asgard, while Honir and Mimir went to live among the Vanir. This exchange brought new wisdom to Asgard, for the Vanir were gods of fertility, prosperity, and foresight. Freya, in particular, taught the Aesir the art of Seder magic, a form of divination and sorcery that allowed the practitioner to see into the future and influence fate itself. Even Odin, the All-Father, learned this art from her, though it was traditionally practiced by women. Among the gods who dwelt in Asgard, none was more beloved than Balder the Beautiful. Son of Odin and Frigg, Balder was the god of light, purity, and summer. His beauty was so great that light seemed to shine from his very presence, and his wisdom was renowned throughout all the realms. Balder was married to Nanna, and together they lived in the hall, called Breidablik, whose silver roof was supported by golden pillars and from which nothing false or impure could enter. But even in the golden halls of Asgard, shadows were beginning to form. Among the gods lived one whose nature was more complex than the others. Loki, son of the giant Laufey, had been adopted into the Aesir through a bond of blood brotherhood with Odin himself. In the early days, Loki's cleverness and shape-shifting abilities had proven invaluable to the gods. When they needed to escape from difficult situations or required cunning solutions to seemingly impossible problems, it was Loki who provided the answers. Loki's children, however, would prove to be instruments of destiny. With the giantess Angerboda, he had fathered 3 beings who would play crucial roles in the fate of the gods. The first was Fenrir, a wolf whose strength would grow beyond all measure. The second was Jörmungandr, the world's serpent, who already encircled Midgard in the ocean. The third was Hel, the goddess of the dead, who ruled over those who died of sickness or age in her realm beneath the roots of Yggdrasil. When the gods learned of these offspring through prophecy, they were troubled. The Volvas, the wise women who could see into the future, spoke of the crucial role these beings would play in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The prophecies spoke of a time when Fenrir would devour Odin himself, when Jörmungandr would emerge from the ocean to poison the sky, and when Hel would lead an army of the dead against Asgard. Despite these ominous prophecies, the gods initially tried to accommodate Loki's children. They brought Fenrir to Asgard as a pup, hoping that by raising him among them, they could prevent the dark future that had been foretold. Only Tyr, the god of war and justice, was brave enough to feed the growing wolf. For even as a young creature, Fenrir's strength and ferocity were apparent to all. Hel they sent to rule over the realm of the dead, thinking that by giving her dominion over those who died of natural causes, they could satisfy her nature while keeping her away from the living. She established her hall, Eljudnir, in the depths of Helheim, where she received the souls of the deceased with neither warmth nor cruelty, but with the cold neutrality of death itself. Jörmungandr they cast into the ocean surrounding Midgard, believing that the vast sea would contain him. But the serpent grew in the depths, feeding on the creatures of the deep until he became so large that he could wrap around the entire world and grasp his own tail. There he lay, hidden beneath the waves, waiting for the time when he would emerge to fulfill his destiny. As Fenrir continued to grow in size and strength, the gods became increasingly concerned. The wolf's appetite was enormous, and his playful wrestling matches with the gods were becoming dangerous. Even Tyr, the bravest of the gods, began to feel uneasy when feeding the beast. The Völva's prophecies echoed in the minds of the Aesir, speaking of the day when Fenrir would break free and devour the Allfather himself. Finally, the gods decided that they must bind Fenrir before he became too powerful to control. They approached the wolf with a thick chain called lading, telling him they wished to test his strength. Fenrir, who was still relatively young and eager to prove his might, agreed to the challenge. With little effort, he broke the chain into pieces, much to the concern of the watching gods. Undeterred, the gods forged an even stronger chain, twice as thick as the first, which they named Dromi. Again, they approached Fenrir with the pretense of testing his growing strength. The wolf examined the heavier chain, and though he found it more challenging than the first, he eventually agreed to be bound. With a great effort that made his muscles bulge and his eyes glow with inner fire, Fenrir shattered Dromi as well, sending the gods' hopes crashing down with the broken links. Realizing that no ordinary chain could hold the wolf, Odin sent messengers to Svartalfheim, the realm of the dark elves and dwarves. These master craftsmen were known throughout the Nine Realms for their ability to create objects of incredible power and subtle magic. The All-Father commissioned them to forge a binding unlike any other, one that could hold even the strongest of creatures. The dwarves worked with materials that seemed impossible to obtain. They gathered the sound of a cat's footstep, the breath of a fish, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, and the spittle of a bird. From these impossible things, they wove a ribbon that appeared as thin and soft as silk, but which contained the power to bind anything, no matter how strong. This ribbon they called Gleipnir, and it was a marvel of magical craftsmanship. Though it looked delicate enough to be torn by a child, it contained the concentrated essence of impossibility itself. When the gods received it from the dwarven messengers, they marveled at its deceptive appearance, for it seemed too frail to hold even an ordinary wolf, much less the mighty Fenrir. The gods took Gleipnir to Fenrir, but this time their approach was different. They suggested a journey to a small island called Lyngvi, in the middle of Lake Amsvartnir, where they could test the wolf's strength in private. Fenrir, now grown to enormous size and possessed of wisdom that matched his strength, was immediately suspicious of their motives. When they produced Gleipnir and asked him to allow himself to be bound by it, Fenrir's eyes narrowed with distrust. The ribbon appeared so thin and weak that being bound by it would bring him no honor. Yet something in the god's manner suggested that this was no ordinary binding. The wolf's keen senses detected the magic woven into the seemingly simple cord. and he realized that this was no test of strength, but an attempt to imprison him permanently. "If this ribbon is as weak as it appears," Fenrir said, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder, "then there is no glory for me in breaking it." The gods looked at one another with growing unease. They knew that whoever placed his hand in Fenrir's mouth would lose it when the wolf realized he had been betrayed. None of them wished to make such a sacrifice, yet they also knew that Fenrir would not submit to binding without this guarantee. It was Tyr who finally stepped forward. The god of war and justice, who had fed Fenrir from puppyhood and who understood the necessity of what they were about to do, slowly approached the great wolf. Tyr's sacrifice was not made lightly, for he knew that justice sometimes required personal cost and that the greater good sometimes demanded individual suffering. With solemn dignity, Tyr placed his right hand, his sword hand, between Fenrir's massive jaws. The wolf's teeth, each as long as a sword blade, rested gently against the god's wrist, but Fenrir made no move to bite down. The other gods quickly wound Gleipnir around the wolf's legs and body, securing it with knots that had been blessed with binding magic. When they had finished, the gods stepped back and called upon Fenrir to break free, as he had done with the previous chains. The wolf strained against his bonds, his muscles rippling with effort, his eyes blazing with fury and betrayal. But Gleipnir held firm, growing tighter with each struggle, until Fenrir realized the truth of what had been done to him. With a roar of rage that shook the island and sent waves across the lake, Fenrir bit down hard, severing Tyr's hand at the wrist. The god of war bore the pain without complaint, understanding that this was the price of their deception. But the sound of his stifled groan echoed across the water like a lament. The gods secured Gleipnir to a great boulder called Gjöll, and then bound the boulder itself to an even larger stone called Thviti, driving it deep into the earth. To prevent Fenrir from biting them during his struggles, they placed a sword in his mouth, with the hilt braced against his lower jaw and the point against his upper palate. The wolf's howls of fury became constant, and his saliva, running from his mouth around the sword, formed a river called Van, which flows still in the realm of the gods. But in binding Fenrir, the gods had broken their oath and betrayed the trust of one who had lived among them. This act of necessary treachery planted the first seeds of their own destruction, for Fenrir's rage would burn like an unquenchable fire until the day he broke free to claim his revenge. The binding of Fenrir marked the beginning of a change in Loki's relationship with the gods. Where once his mischief had been relatively harmless and his assistance invaluable, now his tricks began to take on a darker tone. The sight of his son bound and tormented filled Loki with a growing resentment against the Aesir, though he continued to live among them and aid them when called upon. It was during this time that Loki's most terrible trick came to pass, one that would have consequences far beyond anything he had done before. Balder the Beautiful, beloved of all the gods, had begun to have troubling dreams. Night after night, he saw visions of his own death, images so vivid and disturbing that they robbed him of sleep and filled his waking hours with dread. When Balder shared these dreams with his mother Frigg, the goddess was filled with terror. Frigg loved her son above all things, and the thought of losing him was unbearable to her. Determined to protect Balder from the fate revealed in his dreams, she set out on a mission that would take her to every corner of the 9 realms. Frigg travelled far and wide, speaking to every living thing, and extracting from each an oath that they would never harm her son. She spoke to fire, and it promised not to burn him. She spoke to water, and it swore not to drown him. Iron pledged not to cut him, and stone vowed not to crush him. Every plant, every animal, every force of nature gave their word that they would not bring harm to Balder the Beautiful. When Frigg had finished her journey, she returned to Asgard with the assurance that her son was now protected from all harm. The gods, delighted by this news, began to make a game of Baldur's invulnerability. They would throw stones at him, shoot arrows, and strike him with swords, but nothing could hurt him. The weapons would turn aside, the stones would fall harmlessly to the ground, and Baldur would laugh with joy at his protection. But Loki, watching these games with growing interest, began to suspect that Frigg's protection might not be as complete as she believed. Disguising himself as an old woman, he approached Frigg and engaged her in conversation about her son's invulnerability. "It is wonderful," the disguised Loki said, "that everything in the 9 realms has sworn not to harm your son." Frigg, proud of her accomplishment, agreed that she had indeed secured oaths from all things. But then, as if the thought had just occurred to her, she added, "Well, there was one small thing. West of Valhalla grows a little plant called mistletoe. It seemed so young and harmless that I thought it unnecessary to ask for its oath." Loki's eyes glittered with malicious delight as he heard these words. He immediately left Frigg and travelled to the place she had described, where he found the mistletoe growing on an oak tree. It was indeed a small, seemingly harmless plant, with white berries and pale green leaves, but it was the one thing in all the 9 realms that had not sworn to protect Baldur. Loki carefully cut a branch of the mistletoe and shaped it into a dart. Then he returned to where the gods were continuing their games, throwing objects at the invulnerable Baldur. Standing apart from the others was Höder, Baldur's blind brother, who could not participate in the games because he could not see to aim. Approaching Höder with false sympathy, Loki spoke softly to him. "It seems unfair that you cannot join in honoring your brother with the others. Here, let me help you." Höder, grateful for the assistance and eager to participate in the celebration of his brother's invulnerability, accepted Loki's offer. Loki placed the mistletoe dart in Höder's hand and guided his arm, aiming carefully at Baldur's heart. When Höder released the dart, it flew straight and true, striking Baldur in the chest. Unlike all the other weapons that had been thrown at him, the mistletoe did not turn aside or fall harmlessly away. Instead, it pierced Baldur's heart, and the most beautiful of the gods fell dead upon the grass, his light extinguished forever. The silence that followed was deeper than any that had ever fallen upon Asgard. The gods stood frozen in shock and disbelief, unable to comprehend what they had witnessed. Baldur, who had seemed immortal, who had been protected by all things in the 9 realms, lay motionless upon the ground, his perfect face pale and still. Then the silence was broken by Frigg's cry of anguish, a sound so filled with grief that it seemed to shake the very foundations of Yggdrasil. The goddess threw herself upon her son's body, her tears falling like rain upon his lifeless form. Odin's face grew dark with sorrow and rage, for he understood that this was not merely the death of his beloved son, but the beginning of the end of all things. The gods quickly realized that Loki was responsible for this tragedy, and their anger toward him burned with the fury of 1,000 suns. But even as they grieved, they knew that Baldur's death was more than a personal loss. The Volvers had spoken of this moment in their prophecies, marking it as one of the signs that Ragnarok was approaching. The death of the most innocent and beautiful of the gods was a crack in the foundation of the world itself. Frigg, in her desperation, asked if there was anyone brave enough to ride to Hel and attempt to ransom her son back from the realm of the dead. Hermodr, another of Odin's sons, volunteered for this perilous journey. Mounting Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse, Hermodr rode for 9 days and 9 nights through dark valleys and over treacherous mountains until he reached the gates of Helheim. The bridge over the river Gjöll that marks the boundary of the realm of the dead was guarded by Modgudr. a maiden who questioned all who sought to cross. She was surprised to see a living man approaching her bridge, for the sound of Sleipnir's hooves was unlike the silent passage of the dead. "Who are you?" she asked. "Who rides the living horse with such thunder? Yesterday, 500 dead men passed this way, but they did not shake the bridge as you have done. Your skin is not the pallor of death, and your eyes still hold the fire of life." Hermodr explained his mission, and Modgudur allowed him to pass, though she warned him that the path ahead was fraught with danger. The messenger of the gods continued his journey until he reached Hel's great hall, Eljudnir, where he found Baldur seated in the place of honor, though his face was sad and his light was dimmed by the shadows of the underworld. Hel herself sat upon her throne, half living and half corpse, her face divided between beauty and decay. When Hermodr approached her and explained his mission, she listened with the patient attention of one who has eternity to spare. "I will release Baldur from my realm," Hel said finally, her voice carrying the echo of the grave, but only if all things in the 9 realms weep for him. Hermodr returned to Asgard with this message, and immediately the gods sent messengers throughout all the realms, asking every living thing to weep for Baldur. And all things did weep, men and women, animals and birds, plants and stones, metals and gems. Even the earth itself wept, and its tears became the morning dew. But in a cave in the mountains, the messengers found an old giantess named Thok, who refused to weep. "Let Hel keep what she has," the giantess said with cold indifference. The messengers pleaded with her, explaining that she alone stood between Baldur and his return to life, but Thok remained unmoved. Only later did the gods realize that Thok was Loki in disguise, ensuring that his trick would have permanent consequences. With Thok's refusal to weep, Baldur was doomed to remain in Hel until Ragnarok, when the bonds between the worlds would be broken and the dead would rise again. The light of the world was diminished, and the gods knew that the beginning of the end had arrived. The gods' anger toward Loki reached its breaking point. They could no longer tolerate his presence among them, knowing that his malice had robbed them of the most beloved of their number. They pursued him across the 9 realms, but Loki, master of transformation and trickery, eluded them by changing his shape and hiding in the most remote places. Finally, Loki took refuge in a house he built on a mountain with doors facing in all 4 directions so that he could watch for his pursuers from any angle. During the day, he would take the form of a salmon and hide in the waterfall called Franini. But even this precaution was not enough to save him from the gods' vengeance. When the gods finally surrounded his hiding place, Loki leaped into the fire he had built and tried to escape as a salmon down the waterfall. But Thor was waiting for him in the water, and the thunder god caught the slippery fish in his mighty hands. Loki struggled so hard to escape that Thor had to grip him tightly by the tail, which is why salmon have such narrow tail fins to this day. The gods dragged Loki to a cave deep underground, where they prepared a punishment that would match the magnitude of his crime. They bound him with chains made from the entrails of his own son Nafi, whom they had killed in their anger. Over Loki's head, they hung a venomous serpent, whose poison would drip constantly onto the trickster's face. Sigyn, Loki's faithful wife, took her place beside him, holding a bowl to catch the serpent's venom before it could reach her husband's face. But when the bowl became full, she had to turn away to empty it. And during those moments, the poison would drip onto Loki's skin, causing him such agony that his thrashing would shake the very foundations of the earth, creating what men call earthquakes. There in the darkness, Loki would remain until Ragnarök, his pain and rage growing with each passing moment, his hatred for the gods burning like an unquenchable fire. The betrayal he felt at the binding of his son Fenrir, combined with his punishment for Baldur's death, transformed him from a mere trickster into the gods' greatest enemy. As Loki writhed in his chains, 3 roosters prepared to fulfill their prophetic role. In Asgard, a golden rooster named Gullinkambi would crow to wake the Einherjar, the chosen dead who feasted in Valhalla. In Jotunheim, a red rooster would sound the call to battle for the giants. And in the realm of the dead, a rust-red rooster would summon the dishonored dead to join the final war. These three roosters represented the three forces that would clash at Ragnarök: the gods and their heroic allies, the giants with their ancient grudges, and the dead who had been denied a warrior's welcome in Valhalla. Each would have their role to play when the final battle came, and each rooster's crow would signal the beginning of the end. The seeds of destruction had been planted. Fenrir lay bound, but not defeated, his rage growing stronger with each passing day. Jörmungandr coiled in the ocean depths, growing ever larger and more poisonous. Hell ruled over the increasing numbers of the dead, building an army for the final conflict. And Loki, tortured in his underground prison, plotted revenge against the gods who had betrayed and punished him. In Asgard, the gods tried to continue their lives as before, but the shadow of Baldur's death lay heavy upon them. They knew that the golden age of their reign was ending, that the forces of destruction were gathering strength, and that the time of Ragnarök was drawing near. The Völva's prophecies spoke of the signs that would herald the final battle, and many of those signs had already come to pass. The foundations of doom had been laid, not through any single act of evil, but through a series of choices and consequences that had built upon each other, like stones in a wall. The gods' decision to bind Fenrir had been born of necessity, but it had bred mistrust and betrayal. Loki's transformation from ally to enemy had been gradual, but each step had led inevitably to the next. Baldur's death had been the result of a single moment of deception, but its consequences would echo through all the realms until the end of time. And so the stage was set for the greatest story ever told. The tale of how gods and giants, heroes and monsters would clash in the final battle that would determine the fate of all existence. The foundations of doom had been established, and now the long countdown to Ragnarök had begun, ticking away like the heartbeat of the world tree itself, marking time until the twilight of the gods would arrive, and the cycle of destruction and renewal would begin once more. The ancient Völvas had seen this future in their visions, had spoken of it in their prophecies, and had warned all who would listen that the end was not truly an end, but a transformation. For after Ragnarök would come rebirth, after destruction would come renewal, and after the twilight would come a new dawn. But first, the old world would have to die, and the price of that death would be paid in the blood of gods and giants alike. In the growing darkness of the approaching end, the gods prepared for what was to come, knowing that their doom was sealed, but their honor was still intact. The choices had been made, the foundations laid, and now there was nothing left but to wait for the inevitable, to face the consequences of their actions with courage and dignity, and to meet their fate with the nobility that had always defined them. The seeds of destruction had taken root, and now they would grow until they bore the bitter fruit of Ragnarök itself. As the ages passed after Baldur's death and Loki's binding, the effects of these cosmic wounds began to manifest throughout the 9 realms. What had begun as cracks in the foundation of order slowly widened into chasms that would eventually swallow the world. The first realm to feel the true weight of approaching doom was Midgard, where humanity dwelt in their halls and farmsteads, blissfully unaware that their world was about to change forever. In those days before the Great Winter, men and women had lived according to the old ways, bound together by ties of kinship and honor that stretched back through generations. Brothers stood by brothers, parents protected their children, and the bonds of marriage and family formed the bedrock upon which all society rested. Communities were bound together by shared oaths and mutual obligations, creating networks of trust that had endured for countless generations. But as the influence of Loki's imprisonment spread like poison through the roots of Yggdrasil, these ancient bonds began to weaken and fray. The corruption was subtle at first, manifesting as small betrayals and minor cruelties that people dismissed as isolated incidents. A farmer might cheat his neighbor over the price of grain, or a warrior might abandon his sworn lord in the heat of battle. But these seemed like individual failures rather than signs of a greater catastrophe. Gradually, however, the breakdown accelerated. Sons began to turn against their fathers, not in the passionate rebellion of youth, but with cold calculation and bitter hatred. Daughters looked upon their mothers with contempt, seeing only weakness where once they had seen wisdom. The sacred bonds of marriage, which had once been considered unbreakable, began to dissolve as husbands and wives found themselves unable to trust one another. Brothers, who had once shared everything from childhood toys to adult responsibilities, now viewed each other as rivals and enemies. Where once they had protected each other's backs in battle and shared their wealth in times of plenty, now they schemed against one another, seeking to claim for themselves what had once belonged to the family as a whole. The very concept of shared inheritance became a source of bitter conflict, as siblings fought over their parents' legacy before the old ones had even drawn their final breath. The warriors, who had once formed the backbone of society, found that their oaths of loyalty meant nothing when gold or power was at stake. Lords who had sworn to protect their followers instead exploited them for personal gain, while followers betrayed their lords to enemies for the promise of better treatment. The great halls that had once echoed with songs of friendship and tales of shared glory now rang with accusations and threats. Even the bonds between generations began to crumble. The elderly, who had once been revered for their wisdom and experience, found themselves abandoned by their children and grandchildren, left to face their final years in loneliness and want. The young, who had once learned respect and patience at their elders' knees, now saw age as nothing more than weakness to be exploited or burden to be discarded. In the marketplaces and trading posts, the ancient codes of fair dealing gave way to deception and fraud. Merchants who had built their reputations over decades of honest trade suddenly found themselves willing to sell spoiled goods or false weights for a few extra coins. Craftsmen took pride not in the quality of their work, but in how successfully they could deceive their customers about flaws and defects. The breakdown of trust extended even to the most sacred relationships. Priests and priestesses, who had served as intermediaries between the human world and the divine, began to use their positions for personal gain rather than spiritual service. They sold false prophecies to those who could pay and withheld the gods' blessings from those who could not meet their prices. The temples, which had once been sanctuaries of peace and wisdom, became dens of corruption and deceit. As moral order collapsed, violence became commonplace in ways that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. Neighbors who had disputes over boundaries no longer sought the judgment of wise men and law speakers, but instead resolved their differences with sword and fire. What had once been disagreements handled through negotiation and compromise became blood feuds that could last for generations. The roads that had once been safe for travelers, protected by the unwritten laws of hospitality and mutual aid, became hunting grounds for bandits and murderers. Merchants who had once journeyed from settlement to settlement, with only their reputation as protection, now traveled in armed caravans, trusting no one and ready to fight for their lives at any moment. In the great halls where kings and jarls held court, the ancient traditions of justice gave way to favoritism and corruption. Laws that had been passed down through generations were twisted to serve the powerful, while the weak found themselves without protection or recourse. The very concept of honor, which had once been the measure by which all actions were judged, became nothing more than a word to be spoken when convenient and ignored when inconvenient. Even the bonds between humans and the gods began to weaken during this time of moral decay. Where once prayers had been offered with genuine devotion and sacrifices made with sincere hearts, now the rituals became empty gestures performed out of habit rather than faith. The gods, sensing this growing distance, began to withdraw their active involvement in human affairs, leaving mortals to face the consequences of their choices without divine intervention. As the social fabric of humanity unraveled, the natural world itself began to respond to the cosmic imbalance. The seasons, which had once followed their predictable patterns, became erratic and harsh. Summers grew shorter and less bountiful, while winters stretched longer and bit deeper with each passing year. The harvests that had once sustained communities through the cold months began to fail with increasing frequency, leading to famine and desperation. It was during one of these increasingly harsh winters that the signs of the approaching Fimbulwinter first became apparent. The snow began to fall earlier than usual, arriving while the last of the autumn harvest was still in the fields. But this was not the gentle snow of a normal winter's beginning, but a fierce blizzard that stripped the leaves from the trees and killed the livestock caught in the open. The wind that accompanied this early snow carried with it a cold that seemed to penetrate not just clothing and shelter, but the very souls of those who faced it. This was not merely the absence of warmth, but the presence of something actively hostile to life itself. Animals that had survived many previous winters froze to death in their shelters, and even the heartiest of men found themselves unable to stay warm despite their best efforts. As the winter deepened, it became clear that this was no ordinary season, but the beginning of something far more terrible. The snow continued to fall without cease, piling higher and higher, until it reached the eaves of houses and blocked the doors of even the most well-prepared dwellings. The cold grew so intense that rivers and lakes froze solid to their very bottoms, trapping fish in ice so thick that spring would not be enough to thaw it. The sun, which had always been humanity's source of light and warmth, began to lose its strength. Each day it seemed to climb less high in the sky, and its rays carried less heat to the frozen earth below. Even at midday, the light was wan and pale, barely strong enough to cast shadows on the snow. The nights grew longer and darker, stretching out until it seemed that dawn might never come again. This weakening of the sun was no accident, but the result of a cosmic hunt that had been prophesied since the beginning of time. In the sky, two great wolves ran their eternal chase, pursuing the sun and moon across the heavens with relentless determination. Skirl, whose name meant treachery, pursued the sun with jaws that burned like fire, while his brother Hati, he who hates, chased the moon with eyes like ice. These wolves were the offspring of Fenrir, inheriting their father's supernatural strength and his burning hatred for the gods. Since the creation of the world, they had run their cosmic race, always chasing but never quite catching their celestial prey. The sun and moon had always managed to stay just ahead of their pursuers, maintaining the cycle of day and night that governed all life in the 9 realms. But as the bonds that held the world together began to weaken, the wolves found themselves gaining ground. Skirl's breath began to scorch the edges of the sun, causing it to flicker and dim like a candle in a strong wind. The heat that had once warmed the earth now had to compete with the wolf's freezing presence, creating an unnatural cold that no amount of fire could dispel. Hati's pursuit of the moon was equally relentless, and his nearness began to affect the tides and the passages of time itself. The moon's light grew pale and wavering, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of the objects that created them. The nights became not just longer, but somehow deeper, filled with a darkness that felt substantial and oppressive. As the celestial wolves drew closer to their prey, the very fabric of time began to stretch and distort. Days that should have been 12 hours long dragged on for what felt like 20. while nights that should have provided rest instead brought only more cold and darkness. The natural rhythms that had governed life since the beginning of the world were disrupted, leaving all living things confused and disoriented. The animals were the first to recognize the true nature of what was happening. Birds that should have migrated south remained in their northern territories, as if they sensed that there would be no spring to return to. Bears retreated to their dens months earlier than usual, seeking shelter from a winter that they instinctively knew would last far longer than any they had experienced before. Domestic animals became restless and difficult to manage, as if they could sense the approaching doom that their human masters could not yet fully comprehend. Horses refused to venture far from their stables. Cattle huddled together in groups larger than normal, and even the dogs seemed nervous and watchful, barking at shadows and starting at sounds that only they could hear. The wild creatures of the forest began to behave in ways that defied all previous understanding of their nature. Wolves, normally solitary, except during mating season, began to gather in packs larger than any ever seen before. These were not the small family groups that typically hunted together, but great assemblies of dozens of wolves, all moving with a purpose that seemed to transcend their individual needs for food and territory. Ravens, the messengers of Odin, gathered in enormous flocks that darkened the sky with their numbers. They perched on every available tree and rooftop, their black eyes watching the human settlements below with an intelligence that was both ancient and unsettling. Their harsh cries filled the air day and night, creating a constant cacophony that seemed to speak of things that mortal minds could not comprehend. Even the trees themselves seemed to sense the approaching catastrophe. Those that had weathered countless previous winters began to shed their leaves and needles early, as if preparing for a cold that would be beyond their ability to survive. The great oaks and ash trees that had stood for centuries began to creak and groan, without any wind to move them, their roots shifting restlessly in the frozen ground. As the first year of the Fimbul winter progressed, the human settlements began to show the strain of the endless cold. Supplies of food and fuel that had been carefully stored for a normal winter were quickly exhausted by the extraordinary demands of the unending freeze. Families that had once been generous with their neighbors now hoarded every scrap of food and every piece of firewood, knowing that sharing might mean the difference between survival and death. The death toll began to mount as the cold claimed its victims. The elderly and the very young were the first to succumb, their bodies unable to generate enough heat to resist the supernatural chill. But as the winter continued, even the strong and healthy began to fall, their strength sapped by the constant battle against the freezing temperatures. Entire communities began to disappear as their inhabitants either died from the cold or abandoned their homes in desperate searches for warmer lands. But there were no warmer lands to be found, for the Fimbul winter affected all of Midgard equally. Those who fled their homes often died on the roads, their frozen bodies becoming landmarks for other travelers who would soon share their fate. The breakdown of social order that had begun with moral corruption was accelerated by the desperation of the endless winter. Communities that had once worked together for mutual survival now turned on each other in violent competition for dwindling resources. Raids and battles became common as groups fought over supplies of food and fuel, with no thought for the traditional laws of war or the protection of non-combatants. As the second year of the Fimbul winter began, it became clear that this was not merely an unusually harsh season, but something fundamentally different from any winter that had come before. The snow that fell was not the normal crystalline precipitation of earthly weather, but something that seemed to carry within it the very essence of cosmic cold. It did not melt when brought near fires, but instead seemed to absorb heat, making the flames flicker and die. The ice that formed on rivers and lakes was not the clear blue ice of normal winter, but a grey, opaque substance that seemed to drink in light, rather than reflect it. This ice was harder than stone and colder than anything that belonged to the natural world. When people tried to break through it to reach the water beneath, their tools shattered against its surface, and the cold that emanated from it burned their hands like fire. The wind that blew during the Fimbul winter carried more than just cold air. It seemed to whisper with voices that spoke of despair and hopelessness, filling the minds of those who heard it with thoughts of surrender and death. Even the bravest warriors found their courage failing when exposed to these supernatural gales, and many simply laid down in the snow and allowed themselves to be buried rather than continue fighting against the inevitable. Throughout this time of earthly suffering, the cosmic forces that had set these events in motion continued their relentless progress toward the final catastrophe. Deep beneath the ground, in his prison of stone and venom, Loki felt the weakening of the bonds that held the world together. His struggles against his chains became more violent and more frequent, as he sensed that the time of his release was drawing near. Each spasm of Loki's rage sent tremors through the earth that manifested as earthquakes in the world above. These were not the normal geological disturbances that had occasionally shaken the ground in previous ages, but supernatural convulsions that seemed to strike at the very foundations of reality. Mountains split open to reveal caverns that glowed with an inner fire, and valleys appeared overnight where none had existed before. The poison that dripped from the serpent above Loki's head began to eat away, not just at his flesh, but at the magical bonds that held him in place. The chains forged from his son's entrails, which had once seemed unbreakable, started to show signs of strain and corrosion. Links that had held for centuries began to crack and weaken, though they still maintained their grip on the bound god. Sigyn, Loki's faithful wife, continued her vigil beside her husband's prison, catching the serpent's venom in her bowl whenever possible. But the strain of this endless task was beginning to tell on her. Her hands, once steady and sure, now trembled with exhaustion, and she was forced to turn away to empty her bowl more frequently than before. Each time she moved away, the poison struck Loki's face, causing him to thrash with such violence that his movements could be felt throughout all the 9 realms. In Jotunheim, the giants felt the earth shake with Loki's struggles and knew that the time of their revenge against the gods was approaching. They began to gather in great numbers, not in the small bands that had occasionally threatened the borders of Asgard, but in armies vast enough to challenge the gods themselves. Ancient grudges that had smoldered for generations burst into flame, and the giants prepared for the war that would settle all accounts. The fire giants of Muspelheim, led by the terrible Surtur, began to forge weapons of cosmic destruction in preparation for the final battle. The flames of their smithies burned so hot that they could be seen from other realms, and the smoke from their forges began to dim the stars themselves. Surtur's sword, which would one day set all the worlds ablaze, grew brighter and sharper with each passing day. In the realm of the dead, Hel observed the increasing numbers of souls arriving in her domain with cold satisfaction. The Fimbul winter was sending her more subjects than any previous age, and she began to organize them into the army that would march alongside the giants when Ragnarok finally arrived. The dishonored dead, who had been denied entrance to Valhalla, were particularly eager to join her cause, seeing in the approaching war a chance for redemption or revenge. The ship Naglfar, built from the nails of dead men, began to grow larger as more souls arrived in Helheim. Each new death added to the vessel's size and strength, and Hel knew that when the ship was finally complete, it would be large enough to carry an army across the sea to Asgard itself. The dead worked tirelessly on the ship's construction, driven by a purpose that transcended their individual desires for rest or peace. As the 3rd year of the Fimbul winter began, the very structure of reality started to show signs of strain. The world tree Yggdrasil, which had stood unchanged since the creation of the cosmos, began to tremble with the cosmic disturbances. Its leaves, which had always been green and full of life, started to yellow and fall, carpeting the ground around its base with the debris of dying divinity. The three Norns who tended the world tree worked frantically to maintain its health, drawing water from the well of Erd and mixing it with white clay to nourish the great ash's roots. But their efforts seemed increasingly futile as the tree continued to weaken. The threads of fate that they wove became tangled and confused, making it difficult for them to see clearly into the future that was rapidly approaching. Nidhöggr, the dragon that gnawed at the roots of Yggdrasil, sensed the tree's weakening and redoubled his efforts to destroy it. His teeth, which had always been sharp, now carried a venom that could eat through even the most sacred wood. Each bite he took sent shockwaves through the tree that could be felt in all the 9 realms, causing buildings to shake and mountains to crumble. The animals that lived in the world tree began to abandon their homes as the great ash grew increasingly unstable. Ratatoskr, the squirrel who had always carried messages between the eagle at the top and the dragon at the bottom, found his paths through the branches blocked by falling debris and dying wood. Even his endless chatter began to slow as he realized that the cosmic gossip he had spread for so long would soon be silenced forever. In Asgard, the gods felt the tremors in Yggdrasil and knew that their time was running short. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, returned each day with reports of the growing chaos in the other realms, their dark wings heavy with the weight of dire news. The All-Father spent increasing amounts of time in contemplation, seeking wisdom that might yet avert the approaching catastrophe, but finding only confirmation that the end was indeed at hand. The Einherjar, the chosen dead who feasted in Valhalla, began to sense that their long training was nearing its purpose. These warriors, who had been selected from the battlefields of Midgard for their courage and skill, started to polish their weapons and armor with renewed dedication. They knew that the final battle would test them as no earthly conflict ever had, and they prepared themselves for a war that would determine the fate of all existence. As the endless winter continued to deepen, the very concept of hope began to fade from the minds of mortals. Children who had been born since the Fimbul winter knew nothing of warmth or plenty, and they grew up pale and weak, their bodies adapted to a world of perpetual cold and scarcity. The songs and stories that had once preserved the memory of better times were forgotten, replaced by grim tales of survival and endurance. The light of the sun continued to fade as Skuld drew ever closer to his prey. What had once been a brilliant golden orb became a wan silver disc that provided illumination without warmth. The shadows it cast grew longer and darker, creating a twilight world where the boundaries between day and night became increasingly meaningless. Hati's pursuit of the moon was equally relentless, and the lunar light that had once been silver and pure now took on a reddish tinge that seemed to speak of blood and violence. The tides, which had once followed predictable patterns, became erratic and dangerous, with massive waves appearing without warning to sweep away coastal settlements. The stars themselves began to flicker and dim as the cosmic order continued to break down. Constellations that had guided travelers for countless generations started to shift and change, making navigation impossible and adding to the sense of universal chaos. The aurora borealis, which had once been seen as a sign of the gods' favor, now appeared as angry red curtains that filled observers with dread rather than wonder. Deep in the ocean that surrounded Midgard, Jörmungandr the world serpent began to stir from the slumber that had held him since the beginning of time. The great snake's movements sent tsunamis racing across the seas, destroying islands and flooding coastal regions with waves that carried the taste of primordial chaos. As he began to uncoil from his position around the world, gaps appeared in the ocean where his massive body had once rested, creating whirlpools that could swallow entire fleets. The serpent's awakening was felt even in the depths of hell, where the dead paused in their endless preparations for war to feel the tremors that announced their brothers stirring. Hell herself smiled her half-living smile, knowing that another piece of the cosmic puzzle was falling into place. Soon, all three of Loki's monstrous children would be free to play their parts in the final drama. As the Fimbulwinter entered its final phase, the remaining survivors in Midgard began to abandon all pretense of civilization. The social bonds that had taken centuries to develop were completely severed, leaving only the most basic instincts for survival. Families turned against each other for scraps of food, and former friends became mortal enemies over the smallest perceived slights. The few remaining temples and sacred groves were abandoned as people lost faith in gods who seemed powerless to stop the endless cold. Some turned to darker powers, making sacrifices to entities that promised relief from the winter in exchange for services that would have been unthinkable in better times. But these desperate bargains brought no real aid, only temporary respite bought at the cost of what remained of human dignity. In the growing darkness and chaos, signs and portents began to appear that spoke of the approaching end. Blood-red auroras painted the sky with images of battling armies, while the howling wind carried the sound of distant war horns. The few remaining seers and wise women spoke of visions that showed the gods preparing for their final battle, donning armor that had not been worn since the creation of the world. The three roosters that would herald Ragnarök began to stir in their eternal roosts. Gullinkambi, the golden rooster of Asgard, lifted his head to test his voice with crows that echoed through the halls of the gods like the call of destiny itself. In Jotunheim, the red rooster of the giants answered with a harsh cry that spoke of ancient wrongs and coming vengeance. And in the depths of hell, the rust-red rooster of the dishonored dead added his voice to the cosmic chorus, calling to those who had been denied glory and life to claim it in the final battle. The sound of these three roosters crowing together created a harmony that resonated through all the 9 realms, announcing to every living being that the time of endings had arrived. The Fimbulwinter had served its purpose, breaking down the old order and preparing the way for the cosmic battle that would determine whether the world would end in darkness or be reborn in light. And still the winter continued, growing ever colder and more terrible, as if the universe itself was holding its breath before the final, cataclysmic exhalation that would bring Ragnarök at last. In the depths of his underground prison, Loki felt the moment approaching when his long torment would finally end. The chains forged from his son's entrails, which had bound him for so many centuries, were now little more than rotting strands that could barely contain his fury. The magical bonds that had once seemed unbreakable had been worn away by ages of poison and rage, corroded by the serpent's venom and weakened by the cosmic chaos that had spread throughout the 9 realms. The earthquakes that marked Loki's struggles had grown so violent that they shattered mountains and opened new chasms in the earth. Each convulsion sent tremors racing through the roots of Yggdrasil, causing the world tree to groan and sway like a ship in a storm. The 3 Norns who tended the tree found their work increasingly difficult as the ground beneath the Well of Urd cracked and shifted, threatening to disrupt the cosmic order they had maintained since the beginning of time. Sigyn, faithful to the end, continued to catch the serpent's poison in her bowl, but her strength was failing after so many years of constant vigilance. Her hands, once steady as stone, now shook with exhaustion, and she could no longer time her movements perfectly with the dripping venom. More and more of the poison reached Loki's face, each drop causing him to writhe with such violence that the very foundations of reality trembled. On one terrible night, When the aurora painted the sky the color of fresh blood and the howling wind carried the voices of the restless dead, Sigin's bowl finally slipped from her trembling fingers. The vessel shattered against the stone floor of the cave, its pieces scattering like the fragments of a broken world. For the first time in countless centuries, the serpent's venom fell directly onto Loki's face, without impediment. Drop after burning drop, striking his skin like liquid fire. The bound god's screams of agony echoed through every realm, a sound so filled with pain and rage that it stopped the hearts of mortals and caused even the gods in Asgard to pause in their preparations for war. Loki's body convulsed with a violence that had never been witnessed before, his back arching until it seemed his spine might snap, his limbs straining against his bonds with the strength of desperation and fury combined. The chains that had held him for so long finally reached their breaking point. The strands woven from Nafi's entrails, already weakened by time and poison, began to part with sounds like the tearing of the world's fabric. First one link snapped, then another, and then the entire binding system began to collapse as Loki's supernatural strength overwhelmed the magical restraints that had contained him. With a roar that shook the pillars of heaven and the foundations of hell, Loki burst free from his prison. The cave that had contained him for so long crumbled into rubble as he rose to his full height, his body crackling with eldritch energy, and his eyes blazing with the accumulated hatred of centuries. The serpent that had tormented him fled back into the depths of the earth, its task of torment finally complete. As Loki emerged from the ruins of his prison, the earth split open around him, creating a chasm that would become known as the mouth of hell. From this wound in the world's flesh poured forth legions of monsters and demons that had been waiting in the darkness for their master's return. Trolls and ogres, dragons and demons, all the creatures of nightmare that had been banished to the deepest places, now crawled forth to join the army of destruction. The moment of Loki's liberation sent shockwaves through all the 9 realms, for his freedom was the key that would unlock all the other bonds that held the forces of chaos in check. In the ocean surrounding Midgard, Jörmungandr the world's serpent felt his father's release and began to stir from the depths where he had lain coiled since the creation of the world. The great serpent's awakening was a sight terrible to behold. His massive coils, each thicker than the greatest trees, began to unwind from around the earth, causing the oceans to churn and boil as if heated by underground fires. The serpent's movements created whirlpools large enough to swallow islands whole, and tsunamis raced across the seas, carrying destruction to every coastline in their path. As Jörmungandr rose from the depths, his enormous head broke the surface of the ocean like a mountain emerging from the waves. His eyes, each larger than a great hall, glowed with poisonous fire, and his fangs dripped with venom so potent that where it fell into the sea, the water turned black, and all life within it died. The serpent's breath was a toxic cloud that spread across the sky, turning the air itself into a weapon that would choke the life from any who breathed it. The world serpent's thrashing caused the sea levels to rise dramatically, flooding coastal regions and drowning entire kingdoms beneath the waves. Islands that had stood since the beginning of time disappeared beneath the churning waters, their populations swept away by the serpent's fury. The great trading routes that had connected the various lands were obliterated, as the familiar geography of the world was reshaped by chaos. Ships that had weathered countless storms were crushed like toys in the serpent's coils, their crews becoming food for the sea monsters that followed in Jörmungandr's wake. Coastal cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned as their inhabitants fled inland, carrying with them tales of the great snake's emergence that spread terror throughout the surviving human settlements. The poisonous vapors that rose from the serpent's breath began to mingle with the already corrupted atmosphere of the Fimbul winter, creating a toxic fog that rolled across the land like a plague. Those who breathed this foul air found their lungs burning and their strength failing, while plants and animals died wherever the cloud passed. The very sky seemed to weep poison rain that killed whatever it touched. Even as Jörmungandr wreaked havoc in the oceans, another ancient binding was approaching its moment of failure. On the island of Lyngvi, where Fenrir had been chained for so long, the great wolf felt the tremors of cosmic change and knew that his time of revenge was at hand. The magical ribbon Gleipnir, which had held him captive since his youth, began to show signs of strain as the cosmic order that had given it power started to collapse. Fenrir had grown during his captivity, not just in size, but in rage and cunning. No longer the playful pup who had wrestled with the gods in Asgard's halls, he had become something far more terrible, a creature of pure vengeance whose every thought was focused on the destruction of those who had betrayed him. His eyes burned with intelligent hatred, and his strength had increased beyond all measure as he fed on his own fury. The wolf tested his bonds constantly now, feeling how they loosened with each earthquake that shook the earth. The impossible materials from which Gleipnir had been woven were losing their power, as the cosmic forces that had bound them together began to fail. The sound of a cat's footstep, the breath of a fish, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, and the spittle of a bird. All these impossible things that had been woven into the ribbon were returning to their original state of impossibility. On the night when Loki broke free from his prison, Fenrir felt the magical restraints that had held him suddenly weaken beyond repair. With a howl that echoed across all the realms, the great wolf strained against Gleipnir one final time. The ribbon, which had seemed so delicate yet had proven stronger than iron, finally snapped like a thread pulled too tight. The moment of Fenrir's liberation was marked by a sound like the breaking of the world itself. The wolf rose to his full height, revealing a creature so massive that his head brushed the clouds and his paws could crush mountains. His fur was black as the space between stars, and his teeth gleamed like polished weapons in the dim light of the dying sun. The sword that had been placed in his mouth to prevent him from biting fell to the ground, its blade shattered by the force of his jaws. The river Van, which had been formed by the wolf's saliva during his long captivity, now ran red with the blood of his rage. Fenrir's first act upon gaining his freedom was to howl a challenge that could be heard in every realm, a sound that spoke of justice long delayed and vengeance finally within reach. The echoes of that howl drove mortals mad with terror and caused even the bravest warriors to feel their courage falter. With his father and brother now free, Fenrir began his journey toward the final battlefield, his massive paws leaving craters in the earth with each step. Behind him followed a pack of lesser wolves, his children and grandchildren who had been born during his captivity and raised on stories of the gods' treachery. These wolves, though smaller than their patriarch, were still creatures of supernatural size and fury, and they spread across the land like a plague of fangs and claws. In the realm of the dead, Hel felt the liberation of her father and brothers, and knew that the time had come to complete the preparations for war. The ship Naglfar, built from the nail clippings of the dead, had been growing steadily larger throughout the Fimbulwinter as more souls arrived in her domain. Now it had reached its full size, a vessel so vast that it could carry an army across the sea, and so terrible in appearance that the sight of it would strike fear into the hearts of gods and mortals alike. The ship's hull was a patchwork of yellowed nails, each one taken from a corpse and bound together with sinews from the dead. Its sails were woven from the hair of the deceased, and its masts were made from the bones of giants who had fallen in ancient battles. The figurehead was carved from the skull of a primordial dragon, its empty sockets glowing with the fire of the underworld. Hel appointed Hrym, a fierce giant who had long served as her champion, to captain Naglfar. Hrym was a creature of tremendous size and strength, his skin blue-black with cold, and his eyes like chips of glacier ice. He had commanded the armies of the dead in countless battles beneath the earth, and his tactical genius was matched only by his hatred for the living world above. As Naglfar prepared to sail, Hel's army of the dishonored dead began to board the vessel. These were not the glorious Einherjar who feasted in Valhalla, but rather those who had died of sickness, old age, or cowardice, all those whom the gods had deemed unworthy of a warrior's afterlife. Their numbers had swollen during the Fimbul winter, and they carried with them the resentment of souls who had been denied the honor they believed they deserved. Among the dead who boarded Naglfar were warriors who had fallen to disease rather than enemy blades, farmers who had starved during harsh winters, women who had died in childbirth, and children who had never lived to see their first battle. All of them bore the pallor of death and the cold fire of the underworld in their eyes, and all of them were eager to prove their worth in the final conflict. The loading of Naglfar took place in the harbour of Hel's realm, where the river Gjöll met the sea of the dead. The air was filled with the moaning of the deceased and the creaking of the ship's bones as it settled under the weight of its cargo. Hel herself stood at the quay, her half-living face showing satisfaction as she watched her father's prophecy begin to unfold. As the army of the dead prepared to sail, the giants of Jotunheim began their own march toward the final battlefield. Led by their ancient king, Utgard Loki, and accompanied by frost giants whose breath could freeze entire armies, they streamed out of their mountain fortresses like an avalanche of hatred and vengeance. These giants remembered every slight and insult they had received from the gods, every broken promise and betrayed trust, and they carried with them weapons forged in the fires of their rage. The fire giants of Muspelheim also began to move, led by their terrible Lord Surtur, whose flaming sword could cleave through the very fabric of reality. Behind him marched legions of flame demons and lava trolls, creatures born from the primordial fires that had helped create the world and would now help destroy it. Their passage left a trail of molten rock and ash, and the heat of their presence could be felt from miles away. As these armies of destruction began to converge, the gods in Asgard finally realized that the moment they had long dreaded was at hand. The golden halls of the Aesir, which had rung with laughter and song for so many centuries, now echoed with the sounds of preparation for war. Warriors donned armor that had not been worn since the creation of the world, and weapons that had hung on walls as trophies were taken down and sharpened for battle. Odin the All-Father stood in his high seat, Hlidskjalf, from which he could see into all the 9 realms, and watched with growing alarm as the forces of chaos gathered their strength. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, brought him reports of Loki's escape, Fenrir's liberation, and Jörmungandr's emergence from the depths. Each piece of news confirmed what the Volvas had prophesied long ago, that the end of the gods was approaching, and that nothing could now prevent the final battle. The All-Father's single eye, which he had sacrificed for wisdom at Mimir's well, showed him visions of the approaching conflict with terrible clarity. He saw the armies of the dead sailing across dark waters, the giants marching across frozen wastes, and the great wolf leading his pack toward Asgard. Most terrible of all, he saw his own fate, Fenrir's jaws closing around him in the final moments of the battle, fulfilling the prophecy that had led to the wolf's binding so long ago. Yet even in the face of certain doom, Odin did not despair. The wisdom he had gained through his sacrifices had taught him that endings were also beginnings, that destruction could clear the way for creation, and that even the twilight of the gods might lead to a new dawn. He began to make preparations not just for the final battle, but for what might come after, ensuring that something of value would survive the coming catastrophe. The All-Father's first act was to send his Valkyries throughout Midgard to gather the greatest warriors who had fallen during the Fimbul winter. These battle maidens, led by Brunhild the Bold, rode their 8-legged horses through the realm of the dead, selecting souls who had shown exceptional courage in their final moments. Though these warriors had not died in traditional battle, Their bravery in facing the supernatural horrors of the endless winter had marked them as worthy of Valhalla. As the Valkyries carried out their grim task, the gods began to arm themselves for the final conflict. Thor, the thunder god, hefted his mighty hammer Mjolnir and felt its weight with satisfaction. The weapon had been forged by the dwarves to be the ultimate destroyer of giants, and now it would face its greatest test. The god's belt of strength and iron gloves were polished and blessed, preparing him for the battle with Jörmungandr that had been foretold since the serpent's birth. Freyr, the god of fertility and prosperity, faced a more troubling situation as he prepared for war. Long ago, he had traded away his magical sword for the chance to win the love of the giantess Gerda, and now he would face the final battle without his most potent weapon. The god knew that this sacrifice would likely cost him his life, but he accepted his fate with the dignity befitting one of the Vanir. Tyr, the one-handed god of war and justice, sharpened his remaining blade with grim determination. He had already paid the price for the binding of Fenrir, and now he would face the consequences of that necessary act. The god felt no regret for his role in the wolf's imprisonment, knowing that it had delayed the final catastrophe and given the gods precious time to prepare for their ultimate test. Vidar, Odin's son, who was destined to survive Ragnarok, began to craft the thick boot that would enable him to slay Fenrir after the wolf had devoured his father. This boot was made from all the leather scraps that had been discarded by shoemakers since the beginning of time, and it was strong enough to resist even the great wolf's teeth. Vidar worked in silence, knowing that his survival would depend on the quality of his craftsmanship. Balder remained in Hel's realm, unable to return to aid his family in their hour of greatest need. But even from the land of the dead, the god of light and purity served a purpose, for his presence among the deceased offered hope that death was not the final end. The prophecies spoke of his eventual return, when the new world would need his light to banish the darkness left by Ragnarök. As the gods prepared for battle, Heimdall the watchman stood at his post beside the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, his keen senses alert for any sign of the approaching enemy forces. The guardian of Asgard could see farther than any other being, hear the grass growing in distant fields, and detect the approach of danger from any direction. His great horn Gjallarhorn hung at his side, ready to sound the final alarm that would summon all the gods to their ultimate battle. Heimdall's vigil was a lonely one, for he knew that his warning would herald not victory, but doom. The watchman had long foreseen his own fate, a mutual destruction with Loki that would end both their lives in the final moments of the cosmic battle. Yet he maintained his post with unwavering dedication, understanding that duty transcended personal survival. The Rainbow Bridge itself began to show signs of strain as the cosmic order collapsed around it. Bifrost, which had connected Asgard to the other realms since the beginning of time, flickered and wavered like a candle flame in a strong wind. Its colors, once brilliant and pure, now carried an ominous tinge that spoke of the approaching end. Heimdall knew that the bridge would not survive the weight of the armies that would soon attempt to cross it. In the vast plain called Vigrid, which lay in the neutral territory between the realms, the stage was being set for the final confrontation. This field, which stretched for 100 leagues in every direction, had been chosen by fate itself as the site where gods and giants, heroes and monsters, would meet in the battle that would determine the future of all existence. The ground was hard and level, perfect for the clash of armies, and the sky above was vast enough to accommodate the cosmic forces that would soon be unleashed. Ancient prophecies had spoken of Vigrid as the place where all debts would be settled and all fates fulfilled. Here Odin would face Fenrir, Thor would battle Jörmungandr, and Heimdall would meet Loki in their final confrontation. the field would be watered with the blood of gods and giants alike, and from that blood would spring the seeds of the world that was to come. As Loki emerged fully from his underground prison, he began to gather his allies for the march to Vigrid. The trickster god had been transformed by his long imprisonment into something far more terrible than he had ever been before. His shape-shifting abilities had been enhanced by centuries of pain and rage, and he could now assume forms that had never been seen in any of the realms. The army that assembled around Loki was a nightmare made manifest. Trolls and ogres marched alongside demons and dragons, while giants of frost and fire stood shoulder to shoulder in their shared hatred of the gods. Above them flew creatures of shadow and flame, their wings blotting out what little light remained from the dying sun. At the center of this host walked Loki himself, his presence a beacon of chaos that drew all the forces of destruction to his banner. As this terrible army began its march toward Vigrid, Heimdall's supernatural senses detected their approach long before they came within sight of normal eyes. The watchman felt the earth tremble under the feet of giants, heard the roar of dragons in the distance, and saw the smoke of their passage rising on the horizon. The moment he had long dreaded was finally at hand. With hands that trembled only slightly despite his divine nature, Heimdall raised the great horn Gjallarhorn to his lips. The instrument had been forged at the beginning of time to sound the final alarm, and its voice could carry to every corner of the 9 realms. As the watchman took a deep breath and prepared to blow the horn that would herald the end of all things, he offered a silent prayer to whatever powers might survive the coming catastrophe. The first note of Gjallarhorn rang out across the cosmos like the death cry of the universe itself. The sound was deeper than thunder, more piercing than the wind, and filled with such power that it shattered mountains and dried up seas. In Asgard, the gods heard the call and knew that their final hour had arrived. In Midgard, the few surviving humans looked up at the sky and saw that the stars themselves were trembling at the sound. The second note followed the first, harmonizing with it to create a chord that seemed to contain all the music that had ever been played and all the silence that had ever fallen. This was the sound of endings and beginnings, of death and birth, of the cosmic wheel turning one final time before it stopped forever. The dead heard it in their graves and stirred restlessly, knowing that their time of rest was ending. The third and final note completed the call, sending its message to every living being in all the realms. The time of Ragnarök had come, the twilight of the gods was beginning, and the final battle would soon decide whether the world would end in darkness or be reborn in light. As the echoes of Gjallarhorn faded into the distance, the armies of order and chaos began their final march toward the field of Vigrid, where destiny itself awaited their arrival. The breaking of bonds was complete. The ancient restraints that had held the forces of destruction in check for so long had finally failed, and the powers of chaos were free to claim their revenge. The stage was set, the players were in motion, and the greatest story ever told was about to reach its climax in a battle that would echo through all eternity. The sound of Gjallarhorn's final note had barely faded when Odin felt the full weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders like a cloak woven from the threads of fate itself. The Allfather knew that the approaching battle would test not only the strength of the gods, but their wisdom as well, and that knowledge would be as crucial as weapons in the conflict to come. With time running short and the armies of chaos already marching toward Vigrid, Odin began a desperate quest for any scrap of insight that might tip the balance in favor of the forces of light. The ravens, Hugin and Munin, whose names meant thought and memory, were dispatched to every corner of the 9 realms to gather intelligence about the enemy forces. These wise birds had served as Odin's eyes and ears since the beginning of time, but never had their mission been more crucial than now. They flew through the toxic clouds that surrounded Jörmungandr. dodged the flames that marked Surtur's passage, and ventured into the deepest caverns where the most ancient of giants had awakened from their millennial slumbers. When the ravens returned, their reports painted a picture of devastation beyond anything the gods had imagined. Hugin spoke of armies so vast they covered the horizon like a black tide, while Munin described weapons forged in the fires of primordial chaos and tempered in the hatred of ages. The birds told of giants whose footsteps cracked the foundations of mountains, of demons whose very presence withered the grass beneath their feet, and of creatures from the deepest hells that had never before walked under the light of sun or moon. But Odin's hunger for knowledge was not satisfied by the reports of his faithful ravens. The All-Father knew that somewhere in the vast tapestry of wisdom and prophecy lay clues that might yet change the outcome of the approaching battle. With his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, beneath him, Odin rode forth from Asgard on a journey that would take him to the most dangerous and forbidden places in all the realms. His first destination was the realm of the dead, where the wise women known as Völvas dwelt in their halls of bone and shadow. These seers had the power to look beyond the veil of death and glimpse the threads of fate that bound all living things. Odin had consulted them before, even going so far as to hang himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to gain the knowledge of the runes, but never had he approached them with such desperate urgency. The Völva he sought lived in a burial mound older than memory, where the boundary between life and death was thin enough for the living to speak with the departed. Odin dismounted from Sleipnir and approached the ancient grave, his spear Gungnir glowing with divine light in the supernatural darkness that surrounded the place. The very air seemed thick with the presence of the dead, and whispers in forgotten languages drifted on the wind like autumn leaves. Using the necromantic arts he had learned through his long pursuit of wisdom, Odin called forth the Völva from her eternal rest. The earth above her grave split open with a sound like the cracking of the world's foundation, and from the depths rose a figure wrapped in burial shrouds that had been woven from the hair of the dead. Her eyes were empty sockets that nonetheless blazed with the fire of otherworldly knowledge, and her voice carried the weight of centuries. The Völva asked, her words echoing as if spoken from the bottom of a well. Odin stepped forward, his single eye meeting the empty sockets of the ancient seer without flinching. The final battle approaches, wise one. The forces of chaos march upon Vigrid, and I would know if there is any way to prevent the destruction that has been foretold. The Völva's laugh was like the sound of winter wind through empty halls. You ask me to tell you what you already know, hanged god. The threads of fate were woven long ago, and not even the Norns themselves can change what has been decreed. She paused, her spectral form wavering like smoke in the wind. Yet there are always choices within fate, always small freedoms within the greater design. She spoke then of hidden strengths that lay dormant within the gods, of ancient alliances that might yet be renewed, and of the power that could be found in accepting one's fate rather than fighting against it. Her words were cryptic and filled with riddles, as was the way of seers, but Odin's wisdom allowed him to glimpse the meaning behind her prophecies. When the Völva had finished speaking, she began to sink back into her grave, her duty to the living complete. But before the earth closed over her once more, she offered one final warning. Remember, All-Father, that endings are also beginnings. What dies in one form may live again in another. With these cryptic words echoing in his mind, Odin mounted Sleipnir once more and rode to other places of power and wisdom. He consulted the head of Mimir, which he kept preserved at the Well of Wisdom, offering more of his own divine essence in exchange for insight into the battle to come. He spoke with the spirits of ancient heroes who had died in legendary battles, learning from their experiences of warfare and sacrifice. At the root of Yggdrasil, he found the dragon Nidhöggr still gnawing at the World Tree's foundation. But now the ancient worm paused in his endless task to speak with the god who had once hung from the tree's branches. The dragon's words were filled with the wisdom of destruction, teaching Odin that sometimes things must be torn down completely before they can be rebuilt stronger than before. Each consultation added another piece to the puzzle of understanding that Odin was assembling in his mind. The All-Father began to see that the approaching battle was not simply a conflict between good and evil, order and chaos, but rather a necessary transformation that would cleanse the world of its accumulated corruption and make room for something new and pure to grow. While Odin pursued his quest for knowledge across the realms, the other gods of Asgard began their own preparations for the final battle. In the Great Hall of Valhalla, where the Einherjar had feasted and fought for centuries, the time had come to rouse the chosen slain for their ultimate purpose. These warriors, selected from the battlefields of Midgard by the Valkyries, had been training for this moment since their deaths, honing their skills and building their strength for the conflict that would determine the fate of all existence. The Hall of Valhalla was a sight to behold in these final days. Its roof was made of golden shields that reflected the light of eternal fires, while its walls were lined with spear shafts that had been polished to mirror brightness. 540 doors opened into the hall, each wide enough for 800 warriors to march through side by side. The floor was strewn with fresh rushes, and the air was filled with the aroma of mead and roasted meat that never failed to satisfy the appetites of the heroic dead. Brunhild, the greatest of the Valkyries, rode her 8-legged horse through the halls of the dead, her golden armor gleaming in the supernatural light. Her voice, when she called the Einherjar to their final muster, carried the authority of one who had chosen these warriors from among all the brave men who had ever died. The battle maidens who served under her spread throughout Valhalla, rousing the dead from their eternal feast and summoning them to arms. The response to this call was immediate and overwhelming. Warriors who had died in every age and every land rose from their benches, their weapons already in their hands, and their hearts filled with anticipation for the battle they had been preparing for throughout their afterlives. Vikings who had fallen in raids across distant seas stood alongside Saxon thanes who had died defending their homelands. Celtic warriors who had painted themselves with blue woad fought side by side with Germanic champions who had earned their fame in single combat. Each of these warriors bore the marks of the death that had brought them to Valhalla, yet they were restored to the peak of their mortal strength and beyond. Their weapons had been forged in the divine smithies of the gods, and their armor had been blessed by the All-Father himself. They were no longer merely men, but heroes transformed by death into something approaching the divine. Among the Einherjar were champions whose names had become legend even in their mortal lives. Sigurd the Dragon Slayer was there, his sword Gram gleaming with the blood of Fafnir. Beowulf stood ready for battle, his strength proven against monsters and dragons. Starkad the Old prepared for his final fight, his long white beard braided with rings of gold earned in countless battles. But it was not only the famous heroes who answered the call. Common soldiers who had died bravely in forgotten skirmishes, farmers who had taken up arms to defend their families, and young men who had fallen in their first battles, all stood ready to fight alongside the greatest champions of history. In death, all distinctions of birth and station had been erased, leaving only the pure essence of courage and honor that had earned them their place in Valhalla. The Valkyries moved among the assembled warriors, distributing weapons and armor that had been crafted specifically for this final battle. Each piece of equipment was a masterwork that combined divine artistry with deadly function. Swords that could cut through any armor, spears that never missed their mark, and shields that could turn aside the strongest blows were distributed according to each warrior's needs and abilities. As the Einherjar prepared for battle, the gods themselves began to don their own armor and gather their weapons. In the armory of Asgard, where the divine weapons had been stored since the creation of the world, each god selected the tools they would need for the coming conflict. These were not merely physical weapons, but instruments of cosmic power that could shape the very fabric of reality. Thor, the thunder god, lifted his mighty hammer Mjolnir from its resting place, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. The weapon had been forged by the dwarven brothers Broker and Eitri from the heart of a dying star, and its power was matched only by its accuracy. No matter how it was thrown, Mjolnir would always strike its target and return to Thor's hand, and its blows could shatter mountains or crack the skull of a giant with equal ease. The god donned his belt of strength, Magngjörd, which doubled his already considerable power, and pulled on his iron gloves, Jarngriper, which allowed him to grip Mjolnir's handle without being burned by its divine fire. His red beard bristled with anticipation as he tested the hammer's balance, sending small lightning bolts crackling between his fingers. Thor knew that his destiny was to face Jörmungandr in single combat, a battle that had been prophesied since the serpent's birth. Tyr, the one-handed god of war and justice, selected a new sword to replace the one he had carried for so long. This blade had been forged from the metal of a meteorite that had fallen from the realm of the gods, and its edge was sharp enough to cut through the bonds of fate itself. Despite having only one hand to wield it, Tyr's skill was such that he could match any two-handed warrior in combat, his missing limbs serving as a constant reminder of the price he had paid for justice. Freyr faced a more difficult situation as he prepared for battle. Having traded away his magical sword for love, he was forced to select a lesser weapon from the armory. The god chose a great axe that had been blessed by the spirits of the harvest, hoping that the same power that had made crops grow might also fell his enemies. Though he knew this weapon would not serve him as well as his lost sword, Freyr accepted his fate with the dignity befitting one of the Vanir. Vidar, the silent god who was destined to survive Ragnarok, continued his work on the great boot that would enable him to slay Fenrir after the wolf had devoured Odin. Every scrap of leather that had been discarded by cobblers since the beginning of time went into this boot, creating a piece of footwear that would be strong enough to withstand even the great wolf's bite. Vidar worked in contemplative silence, knowing that his survival would depend on the quality of his craftsmanship. Frigg, mother of Balder and queen of the gods, prepared for battle in her own way. Though she would not wield sword or spear, her power lay in the bonds of kinship and love that connected all living things. She began to weave protective charms for each of the gods, using threads spun from her own tears and the light of distant stars. These talismans would not prevent the fates from being fulfilled, but they might provide some small comfort in the dark hours to come. The younger gods and goddesses also made their preparations for the final battle. Bragi, the god of poetry, sharpened his silver tongue and prepared verses that could inspire courage in the hearts of warriors, or strike fear into the souls of their enemies. Idun gathered the last of her golden apples, knowing that the gods would need all their strength for the trials ahead. Loki's wife Sigyn, though her husband now stood among their enemies, remained loyal to the gods who had sheltered her during his imprisonment, preparing to tend the wounded in the battle to come. As the gods armed themselves, the very structure of Asgard began to show the strain of the approaching conflict. The rainbow bridge Bifrost, which had connected the realm of the gods to the other worlds since the creation of the cosmos, started to tremble under the weight of destiny. The bridge's colours, once pure and brilliant, now flickered and wavered like the aurora borealis during a magnetic storm. Heimdall, the guardian of Bifrost, felt every tremor that ran through the bridge's span. His supernatural senses detected the massive forces that were converging on the 9 realms, and he knew that the ancient structure would not survive the passage of the armies that were gathering for the final battle. The Watchmen began to prepare the defenses of Asgard, knowing that once Bifrost fell, The gods would be cut off from the other realms and forced to make their final stand alone. The trembling of Bifrost was felt throughout Asgard as a constant low vibration that set teeth on edge and made even the bravest gods feel uneasy. The rainbow colours that had once been a source of beauty and wonder now seemed ominous, as if they were the last gasps of a dying world trying to maintain its connection to the divine realm. Each flicker of the bridge's light was like a heartbeat counting down to the final confrontation. As the gods completed their preparations, Odin returned from his quest for knowledge, his single eye burning with the wisdom he had gathered from the Volvas and the ancient powers. The All-Father had learned much during his journey, and though the knowledge he had gained was heavy with sorrow, it also carried the seeds of hope. He understood now that Ragnarök was not merely an ending, but a transformation, a necessary death that would clear the way for rebirth. Odin assembled the gods in the great hall of Gladsheim, where the high seat Hlidskjalf commanded a view of all the 9 realms. From this throne, the All-Father could see the armies of chaos as they continued their march toward Vigrid, their numbers growing with each passing hour as more creatures of darkness joined their ranks. The sight was terrible to behold, yet Odin faced it with the calm acceptance of one who had glimpsed the pattern behind the apparent chaos. "My brothers and sisters," Odin began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and the sadness of certain knowledge. "The time has come for us to face our destinies. The forces of chaos march upon Vigrid, and we must meet them there in the final battle that will determine the fate of all existence. I have consulted the wise and the ancient, and I have learned that though our doom is certain, it is not meaningless." He spoke then of the vision that had been granted to him by the Volvas, of a new world that would rise from the ashes of the old, where Balder would return from the dead to bring light to a cleansed earth. He told them of the 2 humans, Leif and Lifthrasir, who would survive the conflagration by hiding in the trunk of Yggdrasil, and who would repopulate the world when the fires had died down. He spoke of the gods who would survive, Vidar and Vali, Modi and Magni, who would inherit the new earth and guide it toward a better future. "We go to our deaths," Odin concluded, "but we go with purpose. Our sacrifice will purchase the future, and our courage will be remembered when the new songs are sung in the halls that are yet to be built." The gods received these words with solemn dignity, each understanding that their individual destiny was part of a larger pattern that stretched beyond their comprehension. They knew that death awaited them on the field of Vigrid, but they also knew that their deaths would have meaning, that their sacrifice would serve a purpose greater than their own survival. With their preparations complete, Odin made one final journey before the gods would march to their ultimate battle. Mounted on Sleipnir, he rode to the base of Yggdrasil, where the well of Urd reflected the roots of the world tree in its still waters. Here dwelt the 3 Norns who wove the fates of gods and men, and here Odin would seek their final blessing for the task ahead. Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld looked up from their weaving as the All-Father approached, their ancient faces showing no surprise at his arrival. They had been expecting him, for his coming had been woven into the pattern of fate long before the world began. The threads in their hands glowed with the light of destiny, and the tapestry they wove showed the final battle in all its terrible glory. "We know why you have come, All-Father," said Urd, her voice carrying the weight of all the past that had led to this moment. Verdandi, who governed the present moment, added her own words. "The pattern is nearly complete, and the final threads are being woven even as we speak." Skuld, the youngest of the 3, who saw into the future that was yet to come, spoke last. "Beyond the ending lies the beginning. Beyond the death lies the rebirth." The Norns then showed Odin the full tapestry they had been weaving since the creation of the world, and he saw how every thread was connected to every other, how each choice had led inevitably to the next, and how even his own quest for knowledge had been part of the pattern from the beginning. The sight filled him with a peace he had not known since Baldur's death, for he understood at last that he was not fighting against fate, but fulfilling it. As Odin prepared to leave the Well of Urd for the final time, the Norns offered him one last gift, a vision of the world that would come after Ragnarök, green and fair, and free from the corruption that had poisoned the old cosmos. He saw Baldur's return, the survival of the worthy, and the birth of a new golden age that would surpass even the glory of Asgard in its prime. This vision would sustain him through the dark hours ahead, reminding him that every ending was also a beginning. The All-Father returned to Asgard to find the gods assembled and ready for their final march. The Einherjar stood in perfect formation, their armor gleaming and their weapons sharp, while the gods themselves were arrayed in the full panoply of war. Sleipnir's hooves rang against the golden pavement as Odin took his place at the head of the host, his spear Gungnir held high and his ravens circling overhead. As the army of light prepared to march toward Vigrid, they could see in the distance the forces of darkness converging on the same destination. Smoke and flame marked the passage of Surtur's fire giants, while the very earth groaned under the weight of the frost giants' feet. The sea itself seemed to boil as Naglfar approached the shore, carrying its cargo of the dishonored dead. Above it all, the toxic breath of Jormungandr spread across the sky like a poison cloud that would choke the life from any who breathed it. The two great armies were approaching the field of Vigrid from opposite directions, drawn by the same inexorable force that had shaped their destinies since the beginning of time. Between them lay the vast plain where the final battle would be fought, where gods and giants, heroes and monsters would clash in a conflict that would determine whether order or chaos would triumph in the end. As the gods began their march from Asgard, Bifrost shuddered under their feet like a dying animal. The Rainbow Bridge, which had served as the pathway between the realms for countless ages, was finally beginning to collapse under the weight of cosmic change. Its colours flared one last time in a brilliant display that could be seen from every corner of the 9 realms, and then it began to fall, strand by strand, into the void below. The collapse of Bifrost marked the point of no return in the cosmic drama that was unfolding. The gods were now committed to their path, cut off from retreat, and forced to face their destiny on the field of battle. Behind them, Asgard stood empty and silent, its golden halls waiting for a fate that would never come. Ahead lay Vigrid, where the greatest story ever told would reach its climax in a battle that would echo through all eternity. The armies of light and darkness continued their relentless advance toward the destined battlefield, their footsteps marking the final countdown to Ragnarök. The stage was set, the players were in motion, and the moment that had been prophesied since the beginning of time was finally at hand. The plain of Vigrid stretched before them like a vast amphitheatre prepared by fate itself for the final drama of the gods. The field was perfectly level, its surface hardened by supernatural forces until it was smooth as polished stone, yet firm enough to support the weight of giants and the charge of divine armies. No blade of grass grew upon this desolate expanse, for it had been set aside since the creation of the world for this singular purpose. The sky above was a canvas of roiling clouds, painted in shades of crimson and gold, by the dying light of the sun that Skirl had nearly caught. As the two great hosts approached each other across the plain, the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of accumulated destiny. Each step brought them closer to the moment when all debts would be paid, all oaths fulfilled, and all prophecies brought to their inevitable conclusion. The sound of their marching was like the heartbeat of the universe itself, steady and inexorable as the turning of the cosmic wheel. The army of the gods moved with the disciplined precision of warriors who had trained for this moment throughout eternity. At their head rode Odin the All-Father, his 8-legged horse Sleipnir's hooves striking sparks from the hard ground with each step. The god's single eye blazed with the fire of divine wisdom, while his spear, Gungnir, gleamed like a star in his grasp. Behind him came the gods of Asgard, each resplendent in armor that had been forged in the fires of creation itself. Thor strode among them like a walking thunderstorm, his red beard crackling with barely contained lightning, and his hammer, Mjolnir, humming with the power to split mountains. Tyr marched with his sword drawn, the one-handed god's face set in grim determination as he prepared to face the consequences of his ancient choice. Freyr carried his replacement axe with quiet dignity, accepting the fate that his sacrifice for love had made inevitable. Behind the gods came the Einherjar, the chosen slain of Valhalla, their ranks stretching back as far as the eye could see. These heroes of legend and forgotten champions of humble battles moved as one, their weapons and armor creating a symphony of martial music that spoke of courage refined by death into its purest form. Above them flew the Valkyries, their war cries echoing across the plain as they prepared to gather the souls of those who would fall in the final battle. From the opposite direction came the forces of chaos, a tide of darkness that seemed to swallow the very light from the sky. At their head stalked Loki, transformed by his long imprisonment into something far more terrible than the mere trickster he had once been. His shape shifted constantly as he walked, sometimes appearing as a giant wreathed in flames, sometimes as a wolf with eyes like dying stars, and sometimes as a serpent whose coils could crush mountains. Behind Loki came his monstrous children, each a force of destruction given flesh and form. Fenrir bounded across the plain on paws that left craters in the stone, his massive head raised to howl challenges at the sky. The great wolf had grown during his captivity until he was larger than mountains, his fur black as the space between stars, and his eyes burning with the accumulated rage of centuries. His pack of lesser wolves spread out behind him like a living shadow, their howls harmonizing with their patriarch's roar. Jörmungandr had emerged from the ocean to join the final battle, his colossal form stretching across the horizon like a range of poisonous mountains. The world serpent's passage had drained seas and flooded continents, and now his toxic breath formed a cloud above the battlefield that would poison the very air itself. Where his massive coils touched the ground, the stone cracked and split, unable to bear the weight of such concentrated malice. From the sea came Naglfar, the ship of the dead, its hull grinding against the shore with a sound like the breaking of bones. The vessel disgorged its cargo of the dishonored dead, led by the giant Hrym, whose blue-black skin seemed to absorb light itself. These souls of the unworthy moved with the mechanical precision of those who had nothing left to lose, their pale eyes fixed on the gods who had denied them entrance to Valhalla. The giants of Jotunheim marched in formation, their footsteps causing earthquakes that could be felt in distant realms. Frost giants breathed out clouds of killing cold, while mountain giants carried boulders the size of halls as if they were pebbles. At their rear came the fire giants of Muspelheim, led by Surtur himself, whose flaming sword burned so bright it could be seen from other worlds. Surtur was a figure of such terrible majesty that even the other forces of chaos gave him wide berth as he advanced across the plain. His body was wreathed in flames that burned without consuming, and his sword blazed with the fire that had existed before the creation of the world and would endure after its destruction. The giant's face was hidden behind a mask of living flame, but his eyes burned through the fire like twin suns, promising destruction to all who opposed him. As the two armies drew closer, the very fabric of reality began to strain under the weight of so much concentrated power. The air itself seemed to thicken, making each breath a struggle for both the living and the dead. Lightning crackled between the clouds without thunder, while the ground beneath their feet trembled with anticipation of the blood that would soon soak into its depths. When the two hosts were within sight of each other across the vast plain, they paused as if by mutual agreement. This was the moment that had been building since the first prophecy of Ragnarök was spoken, the culmination of every choice and every consequence that had led to this destined confrontation. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, the armies of order and chaos faced each other across the field, where the fate of all existence would be decided. Then, with a sound like the breaking of the world itself, the battle began. The clash was not merely physical, but cosmic, a collision of fundamental forces that sent shockwaves through every realm of existence. The first contact between the two armies created a thunderclap so powerful that it shattered the few remaining stars and sent fragments of light raining down upon the battlefield. The sound echoed through the 9 realms, announcing to every living being that the final battle had commenced. In the chaos of the initial charge, individual combats began to form as fate drew together those who were destined to face each other in single combat. These duels would determine not just the outcome of the battle, but the very nature of the world that might survive the destruction. Odin, the All-Father, found himself face to face with Fenrir, the great wolf whose binding had been the first step on the path to this moment. The god and the wolf circled each other like planets in their orbits, each recognizing in the other the embodiment of their greatest enemy. Odin's spear Gungnir gleamed with divine light, while Fenrir's teeth dripped with saliva that hissed and steamed where it struck the ground. "So, Oathbreaker," Fenrir growled, his voice like the rumble of distant avalanches. "We meet at last as enemies rather than the family we might have been." Odin raised Gungnir in salute, according the great wolf the respect due to a worthy opponent. "I did what was necessary to delay this moment, young wolf, but I have always known it would come." The All-Father spurred Sleipnir forward, his 8-legged horse's hooves striking sparks from the stone as they charged toward the massive wolf. Gungnir blazed with the light of creation itself as Odin thrust it toward Fenrir's heart, but the wolf was faster than thought, twisting aside and snapping at Sleipnir's legs with jaws that could crush mountains. Sleipnir leaped high into the air, his supernatural speed allowing him to dance around the wolf's attacks, while Odin struck again and again with his spear. Each thrust of Gungnir left wounds that blazed with divine fire, but Fenrir's rage seemed to heal them as quickly as they were made. The wolf's massive paws shook the ground with each step as he pursued the darting horse and rider, his howls of fury echoing across the battlefield. The duel between god and wolf was a thing of terrible beauty, a dance of death that embodied the eternal struggle between order and chaos. Odin's wisdom and skill were matched against Fenrir's raw power and burning hatred, each strike and counterstrike a verse in the final song of the world. Around them, the battle raged with cosmic fury, but for these two combatants, nothing else existed save their ancient enmity and the destiny that bound them together. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, Thor the Thunder God had come face to face with his own prophesied opponent. Jörmungandr reared his massive head high above the plain, his poisonous breath forming clouds that killed everything they touched. The world serpent's eyes were like pools of venom, and his fangs dripped with toxins so potent they could corrupt the very air. "Brother of wolves and father of lies' spawn," Thor called out, his voice carrying the rumble of storm clouds. "You have grown large in your hiding beneath the waves." Jörmungandr's response was a hiss that sent poison clouds rolling across the battlefield, forcing even the mightiest warriors to flee or choke on the toxic vapors. But Thor strode forward through the deadly mist, his divine nature protecting him from the serpent's venom, at least for the moment. Mjolnir crackled with lightning as the thunder god prepared to face the creature that had been prophesied to be his doom. The serpent struck with the speed of falling lightning, his massive head shooting forward to engulf the god in jaws large enough to swallow mountains. But Thor was ready, bringing Mjolnir around in a mighty swing that struck Jörmungandr's skull with the force of a falling star. The impact sent shockwaves through the serpent's entire length, causing his tail to lash across continents and his coils to thrash in the distant ocean. Jörmungandr recoiled from the blow, black blood streaming from the wound Thor's hammer had opened in his skull. But the serpent's rage only grew stronger with pain, and he began to coil around the thunder god like a living mountain range. Thor found himself trapped within the serpent's crushing embrace, the pressure threatening to crack even his divine bones. With a roar of defiance, Thor called upon the full power of the storm. Lightning blazed from his eyes, and thunder rolled from his throat as he struck again and again at the serpent's coils. Each blow of Mjolnir was accompanied by a crash of thunder that shook the foundations of Yggdrasil itself, and slowly the god began to break free from Jörmungandr's crushing grip. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Tyr, the one-handed god, found himself confronted by Garm, the great hound that guarded the gates of hell. This massive dog was nearly as large as Fenrir himself, with fur as black as the depths of the underworld, and eyes that burned with the fire of damnation. Garm's howls could drive mortal men mad with terror, and his bite could tear the soul from a living body. "So, hand taker," Garm snarled, recognizing the god who had once fed his brother Fenrir. "You come at last to face the consequences of your justice." Tyr drew his sword with his remaining hand, the blade singing as it cleared its sheath. "I have paid one price for duty already, Hound of Hell." The god and the hellhound circled each other warily, each recognizing the skill and danger of their opponent. Garm was faster than mortal eye could follow, but Tyr's experience as a warrior was measured in millennia. When the hound lunged forward with jaws agape, Tyr was ready, his sword slicing across Garm's muzzle and drawing blood black as midnight. The hellhound's response was a howl that shattered the few remaining pieces of Bifrost that still clung to the sky. Garm's supernatural speed allowed him to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, his form seeming to blur and split as he struck at Tyr from all directions. The one-handed god spun and parried with desperate skill, his sword leaving trails of light in the air as he fought to keep the hound's fangs from his throat. In another part of the battlefield, Freyr faced the most terrible of all opponents, Surt, the fire giant whose sword could cleave reality itself. The god of fertility and prosperity stood before the embodiment of cosmic destruction, his replacement axe seeming pitiful compared to the flaming blade that could unmake worlds. "Lord of the growing things," Surtur's voice was like the roar of a stellar furnace. "You traded away your sword for love." Freyr raised his axe in defiance, though he knew the futility of his gesture. "Love is always worth any price, Flamebearer." The battle between the god and the fire giant was brief but terrible. Surtur's flaming sword moved like liquid fire, its edge cutting through both matter and spirit with equal ease. Freyr fought with the desperation of the doomed, his axe striking sparks from the giant's burning blade, but he was overmatched from the first exchange. When Surtur's sword finally found its mark, it pierced Freyr's heart with a flame so pure it consumed not just his body, but his very essence. The god of fertility fell to the poisoned ground of Vigrid, his death marking the end of the old world's capacity for growth and renewal. Where his blood struck the earth, no grass would ever grow again. As Freyr breathed his last, another prophesied duel was reaching its climax. Heimdall, the far-seeing guardian of Asgard, had found his destined opponent in Loki himself. The two had been bound together by fate since the trickster's first betrayal, and now they would settle their account in the final battle. "Watchman," Loki sneered, his form shifting between giant and wolf and serpent as he spoke. "You who see all things, did you see this moment coming? Heimdall's golden eyes blazed with righteous anger as he drew his sword. "I saw your escape, shapeshifter, just as I saw your binding." The battle between the god of vigilance and the master of deception was a conflict between opposing principles as much as individual warriors. Heimdall's sword blazed with the light of the rainbow bridge he had guarded for so long, while Loki fought with weapons that changed form with each strike, now a sword of ice, now a spear of flame, now claws of shadow. Their combat ranged across the battlefield as Loki used his shape-shifting abilities to full advantage, becoming now a giant to overpower his opponent, now a wolf to use speed and savagery, now a serpent to strike with poison fangs. But Heimdall's supernatural senses allowed him to track every transformation, his sword finding its mark regardless of what form his enemy took. As the duel progressed, both combatants began to show the toll of their conflict. Heimdall's armor was rent in a dozen places where Loki's claws and fangs had found their mark, while the trickster bore wounds that blazed with divine fire where the Guardian's sword had cut deep. They were evenly matched in skill and power, and both seemed to realize that only one outcome was possible. With a final surge of desperate strength, they struck at each other simultaneously. Heimdall's sword pierced Loki's heart, just as the shapeshifter's claws tore out the Guardian's throat. They fell together onto the blood-soaked ground of Vigrid, their mutual destruction fulfilling the prophecy that had bound their fates together since the beginning of time. Across the battlefield, Thor's battle with Jörmungandr was approaching its own climax. The thunder god had broken free from the serpent's coils, but not without cost. His divine flesh bore the marks of the world serpent's crushing embrace, and the poison that dripped from Jörmungandr's fangs had begun to take its toll even on his supernatural constitution. The serpent reared back for one final strike, his massive head blotting out what little light remained in the darkening sky. Venom poured from his fangs like twin waterfalls, and his eyes burned with the hatred of ages. This would be the blow that would end the thunder god and fulfill the prophecy of their mutual destruction. But Thor was ready. As Jörmungandr's head descended toward him like a falling mountain, the god raised Mjolnir high above his head and called upon every ounce of power he possessed. Lightning blazed from the hammer's head as Thor brought it down with all his strength, striking the serpent precisely between the eyes with a force that cracked the foundations of the world. The impact was cataclysmic. Jörmungandr's skull split open like a broken egg, and the world serpent's death cry shook every realm of existence. Black blood fountained from the wound, and the serpent's massive body convulsed once before falling still across the battlefield like a range of dead mountains. But victory came at a price that fulfilled the ancient prophecy. As Jörmungandr died, the serpent's poisonous breath erupted from his body in one final exhalation of pure venom. Thor, standing directly over his fallen enemy, bore the full force of this toxic cloud. The poison seared his lungs and burned through his divine flesh like acid, accomplishing in death what the serpent had failed to do in life. The thunder god managed 9 steps away from his slain enemy before the poison completed its work. Thor fell to his knees on the blood-soaked ground of Vigrid, Mjolnir slipping from his nerveless fingers as the venom stopped his mighty heart. The god who had been the god's greatest champion against the giants lay still beside his greatest enemy, their mutual destruction marking another verse in the Song of Endings. As these individual combats reached their conclusions, the larger battle continued to rage across the plain of Vigrid. The Einherjar fought with the courage of heroes who had already died once for honor, their weapons flashing in the dying light as they carved through the ranks of giants and demons. But for every enemy they felled, 2 more seemed to take their place. And slowly, the forces of chaos began to push back the army of the gods. The death of so many gods in single combat had shifted the balance of the battle decisively. With Thor fallen, no one could stand against the remaining giants with equal strength. With Freyr dead, the promise of renewal and growth had died with him. With Heimdall and Loki both destroyed, the forces of order and chaos had each lost their most vigilant guardian and their most cunning adversary. But it was the battle between Odin and Fenrir that would determine the ultimate fate of the conflict. The All-Father and the Great Wolf had been fighting for what seemed like hours, their combat ranging across the entire battlefield, as neither could gain a decisive advantage over the other. Odin's wisdom and skill were matched against Fenrir's size and fury, and both had taken terrible wounds in their struggle. Sleipnir's supernatural speed was beginning to flag under the constant pressure of the wolf's attacks, and Odin himself bore deep gashes where Fenrir's claws had found their mark. The god's spear Gungnir had drunk deep of the wolf's blood, but Fenrir's rage seemed to make him stronger with each wound he received. As the battle reached its climax, fate intervened to tip the balance. Sleipnir, exhausted by the long fight, stumbled on a piece of broken armor and fell to one knee. It was only for an instant, but it was enough. Fenrir's massive jaws closed around Odin the All-Father, the wolf's teeth meeting through the god's body with a sound like the breaking of the world's foundation. The death of Odin sent a shockwave of despair through the remaining forces of order. The All-Father's ravens, Hugin and Munin, circled overhead crying their grief to the darkening sky. The few surviving gods fought on with desperate courage, but they knew that their leader's fall had sealed their fate. But even in death, Odin's wisdom bore fruit. Vidar, the silent god who had crafted his thick boot from the leather scraps of ages, came upon Fenrir as the wolf stood over his father's body. The great beast was momentarily sated by his victory, his guard lowered by the satisfaction of finally achieving his revenge. Vidar placed his specially crafted boot upon Fenrir's lower jaw and grasped the wolf's upper jaw with his hands. With a strength born of divine fury and righteous vengeance, Vidar tore Fenrir's jaws apart, splitting the great wolf's head and ending the threat that had hung over the gods since the beast's birth. The wolf, who had devoured the All-Father, died in turn, his blood mingling with that of his victim on the battlefield. With the deaths of the major champions on both sides, the battle began to wind down, though the outcome was no longer in doubt. The forces of chaos had gained the upper hand, and the surviving gods were vastly outnumbered by their enemies. One by one, the defenders of order fell beneath the weapons of giants and demons, their heroic resistance overwhelmed by sheer numbers. As the last of the gods fell and the Einherjar were finally overwhelmed, Surtur strode across the battlefield toward his ultimate purpose. The fire giant's flaming sword had grown brighter with each life it took, and now it blazed with the collected fire of all the stars that had died since the beginning of time. This weapon of ultimate destruction was ready for its final task, the burning of the world tree itself. Surtur approached Yggdrasil, which stood at the center of all existence like a pillar holding up the sky. The great ash tree's leaves had already begun to wither and fall as the cosmic order collapsed around it, but it still stood as the last symbol of the old world's stability. When the world tree fell, nothing would remain of the cosmos that had existed since the creation. The fire giant raised his burning blade high above his head, its flames reaching toward the sky like a prayer to the forces of destruction. Then, with all the power at his command, Surtur brought the sword down against Yggdrasil's mighty trunk. The blade cut through the sacred wood like flame through dry kindling, and the world tree began to fall with a sound like the ending of all music. As Yggdrasil toppled, its falling branches swept across the 9 realms like the hand of a dying god. The impact of its fall shook every world to its foundations, bringing down the halls of Asgard, crushing the mountains of Jotunheim, and draining the seas of Midgard. The three Norns who had tended the tree for so long were caught beneath its branches, their own fates finally reaching their end as they were crushed by the very source of all destiny. But Surtur's work was not yet complete. As the world tree lay broken across the ruins of existence, the fire giant raised his sword once more and called forth the flames that would consume everything that remained. This was not ordinary fire, but the primordial flame that had existed before creation and would endure after destruction, the fire that could burn even the ashes of burned things. The flames spread from Surtur's sword like living things, racing across the fallen branches of Yggdrasil and leaping from realm to realm with supernatural speed. They consumed the golden halls of Asgard, reducing them to less than memory. They swept through Midgard, burning away every trace of human civilization and all the works of mortal hands. They boiled the seas and melted the mountains, turning the solid earth into a sea of molten rock. In Alfheim, the Light Elves' beautiful realm burned like a star going nova, while in Svartalfheim, the dwarven halls collapsed as their mountain homes melted around them. Vanaheim's fertile fields became an ocean of fire, and even Jotunheim's eternal ice could not withstand the heat of Surtur's cosmic conflagration. Helheim itself burned, though death had always been thought immune to destruction. The fire consumed not just matter, but time and space themselves, unraveling the very fabric of reality and returning it to the primordial chaos from which it had first emerged. The laws of physics ceased to function as the fundamental forces that held existence together were overwhelmed by the pure essence of destruction. Light and darkness, hot and cold, life and death, all merged into a single burning unity that transcended all categories and definitions. As the flames reached their peak, they began to consume even themselves, burning away the very possibility of fire until nothing remained but a void more complete than the Ginnunga gap that had existed before creation. This was not merely the absence of things, but the absence of the possibility of things, a negation so complete that it negated even itself. The 9 realms, which had existed since the dawn of time, were no more. The gods who had ruled them were dead, their golden halls reduced to less than ash. The world tree that had connected all things lay as burnt fragments in a void that could no longer support even the concept of connection. The twilight of the gods was complete, and the world that had been was no more. Yet in this moment of absolute ending, the seeds of new beginning were already stirring. For the Volvas had spoken truly when they said that endings were also beginnings, and that from the greatest destruction could come the most beautiful creation. The fire that consumed everything was also the fire that would kindle new life, and the void that swallowed all existence was pregnant with the possibility of a world yet to be born. As Surtur's flames reached their ultimate intensity, consuming even the concept of flame itself, the remnants of the old world began their final transformation. The earth, which had been solid and familiar for countless ages, began to soften and flow like water, its mountains melting into streams of molten stone that poured toward what had once been the sea. The very foundations of reality became fluid, allowing new possibilities to take shape from the dissolution of the old certainties. The sky, which had been the dome of heaven decorated with stars like jewels, began to crack and crumble like old parchment exposed to flame. One by one, the stars fell from their ancient positions, tumbling through the burning air like dying embers. These were not merely points of light, but the very sources of illumination and inspiration that had guided the paths of gods and mortals alike. As they fell, they traced lines of silver fire across the darkening heavens, writing the final verses of the cosmic song in letters of light. The sun and moon, those eternal wanderers who had fled before the wolves, Skjold and Hati, for so long, finally succumbed to their pursuers in the chaos of the ending. The wolves' jaws closed upon their celestial prey at last, extinguishing the lights that had marked the passage of days and seasons since the beginning of time. Darkness deeper than any night fell across the dying cosmos, a darkness that was not merely the absence of light, but the presence of unmaking itself. As the stars completed their fall and the last flames of Surtur's conflagration guttered out, the earth itself began its final descent. The solid ground that had supported the weight of kingdoms and the dreams of mortals became as insubstantial as mist, sinking beneath waters that rose from sources deeper than any ocean. These waters were not the familiar seas that had surrounded Midgard, but something far more primordial, the eternal waters of possibility from which all creation emerged and to which it would always return. The sinking of the earth was a sight both terrible and beautiful, like watching a great ship disappear beneath the waves. Mountains that had stood since the creation of the world vanished beneath the dark waters, their peaks the last to succumb to the rising tide. Forests that had sheltered countless generations of creatures dissolved into the flood, their ancient wisdom returning to the source from which it had sprung. Cities and farmlands, the works of human hands and the dreams of mortal hearts, all sank beneath the surface without leaving so much as a ripple to mark their passing. For a time that might have been moments or millennia, there was nothing but water and darkness, silence and emptiness. The void was complete, more absolute than the Ginnunga gap that had existed before the first creation. It was as if the universe had drawn in its breath and forgotten to exhale, leaving only the potential for existence, suspended in an eternal moment of anticipation. But the cosmic wheel never truly stops turning, and even in the depths of absolute ending, the forces of renewal were already at work. Deep beneath the dark waters, where no light had ever penetrated and no sound had ever echoed, something began to stir. It was not life as it had been known in the old world, but rather the principle of life itself, the fundamental force that drives existence to emerge from non-existence and meaning to arise from chaos. Slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the perfect peace of the void, new land began to emerge from the depths. At first, it was nothing more than a speck of green breaking the surface of the dark waters, so small that it might have been mistaken for a floating leaf. But this tiny island carried within it the seed of an entire world, and it began to grow with the inexorable patience of natural forces, freed from the constraints of the old cosmic order. The new earth that rose from the waters was unlike anything that had existed in the previous world. Where the old lands had borne the scars of countless battles and the weight of accumulated history, this fresh creation was pure and unmarked, its soil rich with the potential for growth rather than heavy with the debris of ancient conflicts. Green grass covered its surface like a carpet woven from hope itself, and wildflowers bloomed in colours that had never been seen under the old sun. The air above this new earth was sweet and clean, free from the poisons that had contaminated the atmosphere during the final battle. Rivers of crystal clear water flowed across the landscape, their sources hidden in springs that welled up from the heart of the world itself. These streams sang as they ran, their voices harmonizing in melodies that spoke of joy and renewal, of second chances and fresh beginnings. As the new earth continued to expand, rising from the waters like a green jewel set in dark velvet, other changes began to manifest in the transformed cosmos. A new sun appeared in the sky, not the old familiar orb that Skirl had pursued for so long, but a daughter sun born from the death of her mother. This new source of light burned with a gentler radiance than the old, its rays carrying warmth without scorching heat, illumination without blinding glare. The new sun's light revealed that the sky itself had been transformed. Where once the heavens had been a dome decorated with familiar constellations, now the night was painted with patterns of stars that had never been seen before, These celestial lights arranged themselves in configurations that spoke of hope rather than fate, of guidance rather than judgment. They were beacons for a new age, marking the paths that future generations would follow toward wisdom and understanding. From this renewed cosmos came the first signs that life itself would return to populate the green earth. Two figures emerged from the trunk of a great tree that stood at the center of the new world, a tree that was both Yggdrasil reborn and something entirely new. These were Leif and Lifthrasir, whose names meant life and eager for life, the two humans who had hidden within the world tree during the cosmic conflagration and survived to see the dawn of the new age. Leif and Lifthrasir stepped forth onto the green grass of the new earth, their eyes wide with wonder at the beauty that surrounded them. They were not the same as the humans who had lived in Midgard during the old world, for the fire of Ragnarök had purified them as well, burning away the corruption and hatred that had poisoned the hearts of their predecessors. These were humanity reborn, carrying within them the wisdom of experience, but free from the burden of accumulated sin. The man and woman looked upon each other with eyes that held no suspicion or jealousy, no anger or despair. They saw in each other not competitors for scarce resources or sources of potential betrayal, but companions in the great work of building a new world. Their love was pure and uncomplicated, free from the bitter knowledge that had poisoned the relationships of their ancestors. From their union would spring a new race of humans, one that would inherit the new earth and tend it with greater wisdom than their predecessors had shown. These children of the new age would remember the stories of the old world, learning from its mistakes while embracing the possibilities that the renewal had made available. They would be farmers and crafters, poets and explorers, but they would not be warriors in the old sense, for the new world would have no need for the bitter conflicts that had marked the previous age. But Leif and Lifthrasir were not alone in the new world. As they explored their green paradise, they began to encounter others who had survived the cosmic cleansing and been transformed by it. From the realm of the dead came two figures whose presence brought light to the renewed cosmos: Balder and Höder, the brothers whose tragic fate had marked the beginning of the end for the old world. Balder emerged from the shadows of death more beautiful than ever, his inner light no longer dimmed by the sorrows and compromises that had marked the previous age. The god of purity and summer walked upon the new earth with steps that left flowers blooming in his footprints, his presence bringing warmth and joy wherever he went. But this was not the naive innocence he had possessed before his death. This was wisdom earned through suffering, purity achieved through the cleansing fire of destruction. Beside him walked Höder, the blind brother whose hand had cast the fatal dart that began the chain of events leading to Ragnarok. But in the new world, Höder's blindness had been transformed into a different kind of sight, a perception that saw not the surfaces of things, but their inner essence. The brothers embraced each other with a love that transcended their tragic history, their reconciliation symbolizing the healing that the new world represented. The return of Balder and Höder was a sign that the new cosmos would not simply repeat the patterns of the old, but would incorporate the lessons learned through suffering and loss. The gods who walked in this renewed realm would be wiser and more compassionate than their predecessors, having learned through bitter experience the price of pride and the value of humility. Other survivors began to appear as the new world established itself. Vidar and Vali, the sons of Odin who had been destined to outlive their father, emerged from the hiding places where they had waited out the cosmic storm. These gods carried with them the best qualities of the old order: Vidar's strength and reliability, Vali's sense of justice and protection. But they too had been transformed by their passage through the ending, becoming leaders suited to guide rather than rule, to serve rather than command. Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor, also survived to inherit the new world. They carried their father's hammer Mjolnir between them, but the weapon itself had been transformed by the cosmic fire. Where once it had been a tool of destruction, designed to shatter the skulls of giants and level mountains, now it had become an instrument of creation, capable of shaping the new earth and calling forth life from barren ground. These surviving gods looked upon the green world with eyes that held both memory and hope. They remembered the golden halls of Asgard and the fellowship they had known there, but they did not mourn for what was lost. Instead, they embraced the opportunity to build something better, to create a divine realm that would serve the new earth rather than standing apart from it. As the new world settled into its patterns and the survivors began to establish their roles in the renewed cosmos, signs appeared that spoke of cycles within cycles, of patterns that repeated on scales too vast for mortal comprehension. The Vulvas had hinted at this truth in their prophecies, speaking of events that had happened before and would happen again, of cosmic wheels that turned through eternities beyond counting. In the deepest places of the new earth, ancient artifacts began to surface, relics of worlds that had existed before the one that had just ended. These were not remnants of the cosmos that Odin and his brothers had created from Ymir's body, but traces of even older creations, evidence of previous cycles of destruction and renewal that stretched back through unimaginable depths of time. The wise among the new inhabitants began to understand that they were not the first to walk upon a world reborn from cosmic fire, nor would they be the last. They were part of an eternal pattern, a cosmic rhythm that pulsed through dimensions of time and space beyond mortal understanding. This knowledge brought not despair, but a profound sense of participation in something greater than themselves, a humility that had been lacking in the proud gods of the previous age. Yet this understanding of eternal cycles did not diminish the importance of the present moment or the reality of the new world's promise. Each cycle of creation and destruction was unique. Each renewal brought new possibilities that had never existed before. The new earth was not simply a repetition of what had come before, but a genuine beginning, pregnant with potential that could unfold in ways that even the wisest seers could not foresee. In the gentle twilight of the new world's first day, as the daughter sun sank toward the horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, the survivors gathered together to share their first meal in the renewed cosmos. The food that grew in this virgin soil was sweeter than anything that had existed in the old world, and the water that flowed from the new springs carried in it the taste of hope itself. As they ate together in harmony, gods and humans sharing the same table as equals, they spoke of the plans they would make and the wonders they would create. There would be new cities built in harmony with the natural world, new songs that captured the beauty of the transformed earth, new forms of love and friendship that transcended the bitter divisions of the past. Children would be born into this world, who would know nothing of war or hatred, who would grow up believing that cooperation and compassion were the natural state of being. They would learn the stories of Ragnarok not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a necessary transformation that had cleared the way for their own existence. The old tales would become not warnings of inevitable doom, but reminders of the price of pride and the possibility of renewal. The new world settled into its rhythms like a vast creature finding its breath after a long sleep. Days and nights followed each other in patterns both familiar and strange, marked by the passage of the daughter sun and the rising of stars that arranged themselves in configurations never seen before. Seasons came and went, each bringing its own gifts. Springs that awakened the earth to new growth, summers that blessed the land with warmth and plenty, autumns that taught the value of gratitude and preparation, winters that provided rest and reflection without the bitter harshness of the Fimbul winter. In this eternal cycle of renewal and rest, of growth and contemplation, the inhabitants of the new world found a peace that their predecessors had never known. They lived with the knowledge that they were part of something greater than themselves, part of a cosmic story that would continue long after their individual lives had ended. Yet this knowledge brought not anxiety, but comfort, not fear, but a deep sense of belonging to the universe itself. As ages passed in the new world, the sharp edges of memory began to soften, and the stories of Ragnarok took on the quality of distant dreams. New generations arose who knew the old tales only as stories told around evening fires, myths that explained the shape of the world and the nature of existence. Yet the wisdom contained in those stories lived on, woven into the fabric of the new civilization like golden threads that strengthened the whole cloth. And so the great wheel turned, carrying the new world forward through cycles of growth and change, learning and discovery. Somewhere in the vast depths of time, other cycles awaited their turn, other possibilities prepared to unfold when the moment was right. But for now, there was this green earth under its gentle sun, this community of beings learning to live in harmony with each other and with the cosmos that had given them birth. The story of Ragnarok was complete, but it was also eternal, each ending containing within it the seeds of a new beginning, each destruction clearing the way for a more beautiful creation. In the quiet evening of the new world, under stars that sang of infinite possibilities, the survivors rested in the knowledge that they had witnessed the greatest transformation of all, the death of despair and the birth of hope itself. And now, dear listener, as this ancient tale draws to its close, may you find in its wisdom a peace that extends beyond the ending of stories. Like the green earth that rose from the waters of destruction, may your own rest tonight be a renewal, your sleep a gentle passage from the challenges of one day to the possibilities of the next. The eternal cycle of rest and waking, like the cosmic wheel of death and rebirth, carries within it the promise that each ending is also a beginning, each night a preparation for a new dawn. May your dreams be as green and peaceful as the new world that emerged from Ragnarok's ashes, and may you wake tomorrow refreshed and renewed, ready to write your own chapter in the endless story of existence. The Völvers spoke truly when they said that twilight is not the final darkness, but the gentle transition that leads to morning. Sleep well, and let the ancient wisdom of the Norse cosmos carry you safely through the night to whatever new world awaits you with the rising sun. Thank you for journeying with us through this tale of endings and beginnings, of gods and mortals, of destruction and renewal. May the peace that came to the new earth find its way to you as well, bringing rest to your body, quiet to your mind, and serenity to your spirit. Sleep well, and dream of green worlds rising from dark waters, of hope emerging from despair, and of the eternal promise that every ending is also a new beginning.